Hi everyone. So today's Iceberg is going to be about survival stories of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Stranded on remote islands, lost in the wilderness, surviving natural disasters, and sometimes even cutting off their own limbs to escape certain death. And it's going to be pretty long. So without wasting any more time on this intro, let's begin the video with the very first entry of the Tier 1, Ralston. On April 26, 2003, 27-year-old Ralston embarked on what he thought would be a routine canyoneering trip in Blue John Canyon, Utah. An experienced outdoorsman, Ralston had no reason to believe this trip would be any different from the many he had taken before. However, a single misstep would transform his adventure into a terrifying fight for survival. The day before the accident, Ralston arrived early to Canyonlands National Park. Eager to explore the narrow ravines, some up to 30 meters deep and less than 1 meter wide, he camped in his truck overnight. Confident in his abilities, Ralston neglected to tell anyone about his plans, assuming he'd be back by evening. He packed lightly, bringing only a small amount of food and water, expecting the trip to last only a few hours. By the morning of April 26, Ralston was on his way, biking to the mouth of Blue John Canyon. Around 2:45 p.m., just 5 hours into his hike, disaster struck. As Ralston descended a small drop-off, a loose boulder shifted beneath him, pinning his right arm between the 800-pound rock and the canyon wall. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't free himself. Alone in a remote canyon, 30 meters below the surface and 20 miles from the nearest paved road, Ralston faced an unimaginable dilemma. He was trapped, and no one knew where he was. Ralston spent the first night chipping away at the boulder with a small pocket knife, hoping to dislodge it. After 15 hours of futile effort, it became clear that the boulder wasn't going anywhere. He tried rigging a makeshift pulley system, using a rope to attempt moving the boulder with his free hand, but the massive weight didn't budge. As hours turned into days, his physical condition worsened. Dehydration set in, causing his body temperature to fluctuate uncontrollably. His food supply dwindled. He had only 2 burritos, a bottle of water, and a few candy bars. By the third day, Ralston began seriously considering cutting off his own arm. Using the dull blade from his pocket knife, he made a few initial attempts, but it barely penetrated his skin. Overcome by fear and exhaustion, he recorded messages to his family on his camcorder, saying his final goodbyes and making a last will. He experienced vivid hallucinations, imagining conversations with his family and a vision of a future son he hadn't yet fathered. By the 5th day, out of water and forced to drink his own urine, Ralston reached a breakthrough. Realizing he didn't need to cut through bone, he understood he could break the bones in his arm and sever the remaining tissue. With excruciating effort, he snapped both bones, using his body's leverage. He then spent over an hour cutting through muscle, tendons, arteries, and nerves. Finally, he was free, but the ordeal wasn't over. Ralston still had to hike out of the canyon, rappel down a 65-foot cliff, and walk 6 miles. Bleeding profusely, he encountered a family of hikers who called for help. A helicopter arrived 4 hours after his self-amputation, just in time to save his life. Ralston survived and later became a motivational speaker, author, and subject of the film 127 Hours. Julian Kupka. On December 24, 1971, Lanza Flight 508 took off from Lima, Peru, heading towards Pucallpa. Aboard the plane was 17-year-old Julian Kupka and her mother. The journey started uneventfully, but soon the plane encountered a violent storm. Suddenly, lightning struck the aircraft, and in an instant, it began to disintegrate mid-air, plunging into the dense Amazon rainforest below. Out of 92 passengers, Julianne would be the sole survivor of what became the deadliest lightning strike in aviation history. Julianne, born in Lima on October 10, 1954, was the daughter of 2 German naturalists, Hans Wilhelm Kupka, a biologist, and Maria Kupka, an ornithologist. Her parents had established the Panguana Biological Research Station deep in the Peruvian rainforest. Due to its remote location, Julianne was initially homeschooled, surrounded by the wonders of the Amazon. However, educational authorities eventually required her to finish high school in Lima, separating her from the jungle she loved. By late December 1971, Julianne had completed her education and was eager to return to Panguana with her mother. They had initially planned to depart a week earlier, but postponed to allow Julianne to attend her graduation ceremony. By the time they were ready to fly back, the only available tickets were for Lanza Flight 508. Though the airline was known for its poor safety record, the pair decided to take the risk. Mid-flight, as turbulence shook the plane, Julianne suddenly saw a bright flash over the wing. The aircraft nosedived violently, and chaos erupted. Her mother's calm voice saying, "Now it's all over," was the last thing Julianne heard before everything went silent. Strapped into her seat, she was ejected from the disintegrating plane, hurtling downwards for nearly 3 kilometers. She blacked out before hitting the ground. When she regained consciousness, Julianne found herself alone in the rainforest, still secured to her seat. She had a broken collarbone, a gash on her arm, and a severely injured knee, but she was alive. Her survival instincts, honed from years in the jungle, kicked in. She knew her best chance was to find a stream and follow it, hoping it would lead to a larger river and, ultimately, civilization. For 10 agonizing days, Julianne trekked through the rainforest, battling hunger and exhaustion. She survived on a small packet of candy she had found in the wreckage and drank river water. Along the way, she came across the remains of other passengers. Despite her injuries, she kept moving, knowing that staying put would mean certain death. Eventually, Julianne stumbled upon a boat moored by the river. Weak and delirious, she took shelter in a nearby hut. When the local woodcutters returned, they were shocked to see her, but quickly realized who she was. They took her in, treated her wounds, and transported her by canoe to the nearest village. From there, she was airlifted to a hospital and reunited with her father. In the aftermath of the crash, Lance's operating license was revoked and the airline shut down. Julianne's miraculous survival was attributed to a combination of factors: the cushioning effect of the rainforest canopy and her seat's spiraling descent, which slowed her fall. Despite the trauma, Julianne went on to study biology in Germany, continuing her parents' legacy by returning to Panguana and becoming a prominent zoologist. Reflecting on her ordeal, Dr. Julianne Diller once said, "The jungle caught me and saved me. It was not its fault that I landed there." Stephen Callahan. In January 1982, Stephen Callahan, a seasoned boat designer and writer, set out on a solo journey to cross the Atlantic Ocean. One night, during a violent storm, Callahan's journey took a perilous turn. An enormous force, possibly a whale, rammed into his boat, tearing a gaping hole in the hull. As the water flooded in, Callahan had mere minutes to gather what he could and abandon ship. Desperately, he inflated a small life raft and dove back into the sinking sloop, risking his life to salvage essential items. Blindly feeling around underwater, he managed to grab a few crucial supplies: a fishing line, a water purifier, a spear gun, and some food. His rations were dismal. Only peanuts, raisins, a can of baked beans, a few eggs, some cabbage, and a small amount of water. It wouldn't last more than a couple of weeks, even with strict rationing. Adrift in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, Callahan was utterly alone. Using the stars and an improvised sextant, he aimed his fragile raft towards the West Indies, though his journey stretched on much longer than expected. To maintain his sanity, Callahan divided himself into 2 distinct roles: the captain and the crewman. The captain made tough decisions and issued commands, while the crewmen obeyed, carrying out daily tasks to keep them both alive. This mental strategy kept him from succumbing to despair and helped him maintain control over his dire situation. Weeks passed, and Callahan's tiny raft transformed into a floating ecosystem. Barnacles grew on its underside, attracting schools of Dorado fish, which he learned to catch for food. He even began to recognize individual fish, nicknaming them his doggies. Unfortunately, the presence of Dorado also drew the attention of sharks, which circled his raft day and night. Despite his resourcefulness, Callahan's survival was a day-to-day struggle. His water purifier failed, forcing him to improvise. Using tarps and balloons, he managed to collect just enough rainwater, barely 20 ounces a day, to stave off dehydration. Even more harrowing, his raft was almost lost when a feisty Dorado tore a hole in it. For days, he fought to patch the rip, battling treacherous weather and performing repairs underwater while surrounded by circling sharks. Rescue remained elusive. 7 ships passed by, some as close as a mile, yet none spotted him. It wasn't until he drifted near the Caribbean island of Marie-Galante that he was finally rescued by local fishermen, 76 days after the fateful storm. By then, Callahan had lost a third of his body weight, and his skin was ravaged by the relentless exposure to sun and seawater. In the years that followed, Callahan turned his ordeal into an opportunity. He used his hard-earned knowledge to design a more resilient life raft, which he called the Clam, equipped to withstand similar challenges. Apollo 13. In 1970, NASA was riding high on the success of its previous moon landings. Apollo 11 had made history on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong took the first steps on the lunar surface. This was swiftly followed by Apollo 12's successful landing just months later. As the Apollo 13 mission was announced for April 1970, most people expected another demonstration of human ingenuity and courage. What unfolded, however, would become one of the most harrowing and inspiring tales of survival in space history. The Apollo 13 crew, Commander James A. Lovell Jr., Command Module Pilot John L. Swigert Jr., and Lunar Module Pilot Fred W. Heist Jr. were set to enter lunar orbit and conduct geologic surveys on the moon's Mauro highlands. Their spacecraft consisted of 3 parts: the Command Module Odyssey, which housed the crew, the Lunar Module Aquarius, meant for landing, and the Service Module, which contained essential support systems. But as Apollo 13 soared into space, problems began to surface. 2 days into the mission, on April 13th, the crew was conducting a routine broadcast to Earth. Everything seemed calm and controlled. Then, without warning, a loud bang reverberated through the ship, and alarm lights blinked on the control panels. Swigert's calm but chilling report back to Mission Control would become legendary. "Houston, we have a problem." It soon became clear that one of the service module's oxygen tanks had exploded, severely crippling the spacecraft. The explosion not only damaged the oxygen supply, vital for both breathing and generating power, but it also knocked out 2 of the 3 fuel cells powering the command module. With the primary power source failing, the astronauts faced the terrifying reality of drifting into the black void of space. In Houston, Mission Control scrambled to assess the damage. It was Flight Director Gene Kranz who first voiced the critical plan that would save the astronauts, use the lunar module as a lifeboat to bring them home. Although the lunar module was designed for just 2 astronauts and a short 48-hour lunar mission, it now had to support 3 men for 4 days. Oxygen, water, and power were all limited, and every system had to be meticulously rationed. To complicate matters, the crew needed to perform a series of engine burns to alter their trajectory using the lunar module's descent propulsion system. These delicate maneuvers would require precise timing and the utmost skill to ensure they used the moon's gravity to slingshot back toward Earth. As temperatures inside the lunar module dropped to a bone-chilling 10 degrees Celsius, the crew faced a growing list of problems. Water condensed on every surface, raising the risk of a short circuit in their electrical systems. Even worse, the square lithium hydroxide canisters from the command module, used to remove carbon dioxide, did not fit the round openings of the lunar module. NASA engineers, working with makeshift materials like duct tape and plastic bags, devised a contraption to make the mismatched components compatible, a solution that quite literally saved the astronauts' lives. Despite all odds, the crew successfully performed each critical burn and conserved enough resources to reach Earth's atmosphere. The tension reached its peak as Apollo 13 re-entered Earth's atmosphere on April 17th. For several agonizing minutes, communication was lost as they passed through the fiery re-entry. Then a crackle came through. "Houston, this is Odyssey. It's good to see you." Against incredible odds, the Apollo 13 crew had made it home safely. The mission that was meant to explore the moon instead became a story of survival. Hugh Glass. Hugh Glass's life was like something out of a legend. The tales of his near-miraculous survival and relentless quest for revenge spread far and wide during his time. But despite the many stories told about him, Glass himself never wrote any of them down, leaving the details of his life somewhat mysterious and open to interpretation. What we know about him is part fact and part folklore. Glass is believed to have been born in Pennsylvania to Irish immigrant parents. Some say his adventure began when he was captured by pirates and forced to live on the high seas for 2 years. One day, when the pirate ship was near the Texas coast, he jumped overboard and swam to shore. His freedom was short-lived, though, as he was soon captured by the Pawnee tribe. He spent several years living with them, learning their ways and language. The first verified record of Hugh Glass comes from his time as a fur trapper. He joined the fur trading company of General William Henry Ashley, becoming one of the famed Ashley's 100. This group of 100 men set out to conquer the Missouri River and explore uncharted territories. The expedition included other legendary mountain men like Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger. But the journey was perilous, with dangers lurking at every turn. At one point, the group encountered a large village of the Arikara, a powerful Native American tribe. Initially, their meeting was peaceful, and they traded horses and goods. However, tensions escalated during a long stay, eventually erupting into a violent conflict. The Arikara attacked at dawn, killing several of Ashley's men and forcing the rest to flee. Among those injured was Hugh Glass, shot in the leg during the battle. Despite his wounds, he managed to survive and recover. After this skirmish, the expedition split into smaller groups, and Glass joined Andrew Henry's party, heading towards Fort Henry. As the team's designated hunter, Glass often scouted ahead. It was during one such expedition that he had a fateful encounter. He stumbled upon 2 grizzly bear cubs, and before he could react, the mother bear attacked him. The beast mauled him savagely, leaving him gravely injured. When his comrades found him, they assumed he wouldn't survive the night. For 2 days, the group carried the dying man on a stretcher, but it slowed them down too much. The leader, Henry, asked for 2 volunteers to stay behind until Glass passed away. Jim Bridger and John Fitzgerald agreed. But after 5 days of watching over the barely conscious man, Fitzgerald convinced Bridger to abandon him. They took his weapons and supplies, leaving Glass to die alone in the wilderness. Against all odds, Glass survived. He dragged his broken body across 250 miles of harsh terrain, driven by a single thought: revenge. He crawled, limped, and endured unimaginable pain, eating whatever he could find until he finally reached a trading post and recovered. Then, he set out to track down the men who left him for dead. When Glass found Bridger, he saw a young, frightened boy who had simply been following orders. He spared him. Fitzgerald, however, was now a soldier at Fort Atkinson, protected by the U.S. military. Unable to exact his revenge, Glass settled for reclaiming his stolen rifle. Despite all his near-death experiences, Hugh Glass continued to live the life of a mountain man until 1833, when his luck finally ran out. He was ambushed by the Arikara, the very tribe he had clashed with before. This time there was no escape. Hugh Glass, the legend of the frontier, met his end at the hands of his old enemies. Yossi Ginsberg. In 1981, a 22-year-old Israeli named Yossi Ginsberg set off on what he hoped would be the adventure of a lifetime deep in the Bolivian Amazon. Having just completed his military service, Yossi was eager to experience the world, driven by a passion for adventure inspired by his idol, Henry Charrier, the famous escapee from Devil's Island. After traveling through Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru, Yossi eventually found himself in La Paz, Bolivia's capital. There, Yossi reunited with Marcus Stam, a Swiss schoolteacher he had befriended along the way. The two were soon joined by a charismatic Austrian named Karl Ruprechter, who claimed to be a geologist and treasure hunter. Karl invited Yossi and Marcus to join him on an expedition into the uncharted depths of the Amazon, in search of a remote indigenous village named Toramonas. A fourth traveler, an American photographer named Kevin Gale, also joined the group. Despite the evident dangers, poisonous snakes, jaguars, and territorial tribes, the 4 young men set off. They journeyed by plane to a village called Apollo, then continued by riverboat into the remote wilderness until they arrived at Asariamas, a small community near their intended starting point. Here, the villagers warned them about the treacherous jungle, but undeterred, they decided to press on. The hike was supposed to take 6 days, but the going proved difficult and supplies ran low. To survive, they resorted to hunting monkeys. While Yossi, Karl, and Kevin made do, Marcus, who couldn't bring himself to eat the meat, grew weak and fell ill. His foot became infected, and soon he could barely walk. The group was forced to turn back, but Carl suggested an alternative route, building a raft to navigate the Tuichi River and reach the town of Rurenabak. Once the raft was ready, the four set off downstream. But when they reached the dangerous San Pedro Canyon, Carl abruptly refused to continue, revealing that he couldn't swim and didn't trust the raft's safety. This revelation caused tensions to flare. Ultimately, the group decided to split up. Yossi and Kevin would continue by raft, while Carl and Marcus would hike back to a village. Disaster struck when Yossi and Kevin's raft lost control and broke apart near a powerful waterfall. Kevin managed to swim to shore, but Yossi was swept over the falls. Miraculously, he survived and crawled to the riverbank. Alone in the jungle, Yossi began a harrowing journey to find help. He wandered for weeks, surviving on berries and roots, battling infections, and narrowly escaping death multiple times. By the third week, Yossi was on the verge of giving up when, to his shock, a canoe appeared, steered by none other than Kevin Gale. After being rescued by local villagers, Kevin had returned to find Yossi, organizing a rescue mission that saved his life. Tragically, Marcus and Carl were never seen again. Authorities later discovered that Carl was a wanted criminal, known for deceiving and robbing naive travelers. Despite the ordeal, Yossi recovered, wrote a memoir, and went on to promote ecotourism in Bolivia, eventually helping establish the Madidi National Park. Today, Yossi lives in Australia with his family and remains a renowned motivational speaker. Niki Lauda. Niki Lauda was no stranger to the dangers of Formula One racing. His cold, calculated approach to life and racing earned him the title of world champion, but also the respect of his peers. He was precise, disciplined, and fiercely independent, never shying away from speaking his mind, even when it meant going against the majority. That was just the kind of man he was, unapologetically blunt and relentless in his pursuit of perfection. By the time Lauda entered the 1976 season, he was on top of the racing world, having dominated most of the year with his unmatched speed. He'd already accumulated 61 points, a staggering lead over his closest rival, the charming and audacious James Hunt. While Hunt captivated fans with his charisma and wild nature, Lauda was the exact opposite, serious, methodical, and known for his somewhat harsh appearance. His commitment to excellence was the secret behind his blistering speed. But all of that changed during the 1976 German Grand Prix at the infamous Nürburgring, a track so dangerous it had already claimed several lives. Lauda, knowing the risks all too well, had voiced his concerns at a drivers' meeting, suggesting a boycott due to the poor safety measures in place. Unfortunately, the other drivers outvoted him, and the race proceeded as scheduled. It was a decision that would haunt him for years to come. During the race, Lauda started off strong, but soon realized he'd made a critical error in tire choice. After the first lap, he rushed into the pits to switch from rain tires to slicks, eager to make up lost ground. But fate had other plans. On the second lap, with his tires still cold, Lauda lost control of his Ferrari at a notorious corner. What followed was a horrific crash that sent his car careening into the barriers and bursting into flames. In just seconds, Lauda's Ferrari became a fireball, fueled by the full tank of gas still on board. As his car burned, several drivers heroically stopped their own races to pull him from the wreckage. Among them was former Ferrari driver Arturo Merzario, who managed to unbuckle Lauda's harness and drag him to safety. Lauda's injuries were severe, his face and scalp badly burned, his lungs filled with toxic fumes, and his condition deteriorating rapidly. For 55 agonizing seconds, Lauda had faced death head-on, and many believed he wouldn't survive. He was given his last rites in the hospital, but in a remarkable turn of events, Lauda pulled through. Just 33 days after the crash, bandaged and still in pain, he returned to the track, determined to defend his title. Though he ultimately lost the championship to Hunt by a mere point, Lauda's courage and resilience made him a legend. Those 55 seconds of fire and survival, however, would forever define his life. Beck Weathers. It was 1996, and to the world, Beck Weathers seemed to have met his tragic end on Mount Everest. The mountain had claimed 8 lives during one of the deadliest climbing disasters in its history. As vicious winds roared and the biting cold gnawed at every nerve, Weathers and his fellow climbers struggled to make their way down from the summit. Disoriented and exhausted, Weathers appeared to have succumbed to hypothermia, his body lying still on the unforgiving South Col at a harrowing altitude of over 7,900 meters. In the chaotic hours that followed, a mountain guide and then a doctor risked the deadly conditions to check his state. Both concluded that Beck Weathers, a pathologist from Texas, was beyond saving. No one had ever woken from a hypothermic coma, especially not at such a perilous height. Abandoned on the mountain, he was assumed to be lost forever. The tragic news reached his wife back in Texas, and mourning began. But against all expectations, something miraculous happened. For years, Beck Weathers had pursued a dream to conquer the 7 summits, the tallest peak on each continent. He had already scaled several formidable mountains, but Everest was the most daunting challenge of them all. Driven by an almost blinding ambition, he had dedicated himself to this ascent, sacrificing his family and personal life in the process. His marriage crumbled under the weight of his obsession. Yet even in the face of such turmoil, his focus was solely on Everest. Arriving in the small village of Lukla, perched 2,800 meters above sea level, Beck joined other climbers on a grueling week-long trek through the rugged Khumbu region. They finally reached Everest Base Camp, situated at 5,364 meters, and began preparing for the climb of a lifetime. The journey was meant to test their endurance and help acclimatize to the extreme conditions that awaited. With their bodies conditioned to the altitude, the climbers set off toward the summit on May 9th. They faced the infamous Khumbu icefall and a towering ice wall known as the Lot's Face. Just one misstep could be fatal, and tragically, a Taiwanese climber lost his life on that very day. The plan was to reach Camp 4 at the South Col by late afternoon, rest for a few hours, and then push through the night to summit by noon on May 10th. But delays due to congestion on the mountain meant they arrived at Camp 4 dangerously late, with a brutal storm threatening overhead. As Weathers and his team climbed higher, his vision began to fail him. Weathers had undergone eye surgery a year prior, which unfortunately made him almost blind at high altitudes. When his vision deteriorated further, their guide Rob Hall ordered Beck to wait by the trail, promising to pick him up on the way back. Reluctantly, Beck complied. When the group reached the summit, a fierce blizzard swept through, reducing visibility to almost zero. Beck, stranded on the mountain alone, remained in place for 10 agonizing hours. The storm battered him relentlessly, freezing his body and blurring his mind. Most climbers thought Beck was gone, swallowed by the unforgiving cold. But something stirred inside him. Beck miraculously woke up, disoriented but alive. An image of his family filled his mind, flooding him with a newfound will to survive. Despite being severely frostbitten, his face covered in ice, and his right arm nearly frozen solid, Beck got to his feet. With sheer determination, he began to stumble toward Camp 4, leaving his bag and everything else behind. Against all odds, Beck reached safety, not just surviving but defying death itself on the world's tallest and deadliest mountain. His miraculous survival became one of the most incredible comeback stories in mountaineering history. Poon Lim. On April 5, 1943, 3 Brazilian fishermen noticed something peculiar drifting on the horizon, about 9 miles from shore. Curiosity piqued, they steered their boat closer, only to be stunned by the sight of a frail Chinese man standing on a makeshift wooden raft. He was waving a torn shirt over his head, singing and dancing despite being severely sunburned and emaciated. His good spirits seemed almost surreal. It wasn't until later through a translator that they learned his name, Poon Lim, and discovered that he had been adrift for 133 days. Poon Lim was born on March 8, 1918, on Hainan Island, a small island off China's south-central coast. Growing up during the turmoil of the First World War and a global flu pandemic, his family led a relatively peaceful life as fishermen. But the shadow of war loomed again in the late 1920s, with Japan's invasion of China becoming increasingly imminent. Fearing his sons would be conscripted into the military and sent to certain death, Lim's father moved the family to Malaysia, where they returned to fishing to make a living. But for Lim, the life of a fisherman was stifling. Determined to fight Japanese aggression, he left his family to join the British Merchant Navy as a cabin boy. He embraced his first taste of freedom, though he faced harsh discrimination and low pay aboard the ships. By 1937, disillusioned, he left and worked as a mechanic in Hong Kong until the threat of war drew him back to the sea in 1941. This decision set him on a fateful course when he joined the crew of the 5,400-ton British armed merchant ship, the Ben Lomond. On November 23, 1942, while on its way from South Africa to South America, the Ben Lomond was attacked by a German U-boat. 2 torpedoes struck the ship, sending it to the depths of the Atlantic almost instantly. Poon Lim, against all odds, managed to grab a life jacket and swim away from the sinking vessel. Exhausted and terrified, he drifted for hours until he stumbled upon an abandoned 8-by-8-foot wooden raft, which would become both his prison and his sanctuary for the next 4 months. The raft contained a few meager supplies: a jug of water, a handful of chocolate bars, and some broken utensils. Lim rationed these desperately, catching rainwater and fashioning fishing hooks from stray nails. His survival instincts kicked in as he caught fish with improvised tools and dried them in the sun to preserve what little food he had. At times, he even managed to catch seagulls, using their blood and guts to lure fish. Storms frequently battered his tiny vessel, washing away precious supplies and pushing him further off course. During his ordeal, Lim had close encounters with ships, including a passing freighter and a German U-boat that merely glanced at him before continuing on its way. Another time, a U.S. Navy plane spotted him and dropped a buoy, but a storm snatched away his chance at rescue. Each disappointment brought him closer to despair, yet he clung to life with an unbreakable spirit. Finally, on that fateful day in April, Poon Lim was spotted by Brazilian fishermen. After 133 days and over 1,000 miles adrift, he had miraculously survived. He became an international sensation, receiving accolades and even a British Empire medal. Despite the fame, he remained humble, often remarking that his record as the longest survivor on a life raft was one he hoped no one would ever break. He eventually settled in New York and lived quietly until his death in 1991 at the age of 72. Tammy Oldham Ashcraft. Tammy Oldham Ashcraft's story is one of incredible resilience and survival. In 1983, at the age of 23, Tammy, an experienced sailor, found herself in a life-threatening situation while navigating the Pacific Ocean with her fiancé, Richard Sharp. The couple had been hired to deliver a 44-foot yacht, Hazana, from Tahiti to San Diego, California, a journey that should have been challenging yet manageable for 2 seasoned sailors. However, things took a tragic turn when they encountered Hurricane Raymond, a massive Category 4 storm with winds exceeding 140 miles per hour. As the storm approached, Tammy and Richard did everything in their power to secure the yacht and prepare for the worst. Despite their efforts, they couldn't control the sheer force of the hurricane. Richard insisted Tammy stay below deck, where she would be safer, while he remained tethered above to manage the sails and navigate the boat through the raging waves. In a matter of minutes, a monstrous wave, towering higher than any building Tammy had ever seen, struck the yacht with immense force, throwing Tammy against the cabin walls and knocking her unconscious. When Tammy regained consciousness, everything was eerily quiet. The boat was in disarray, the mast was broken, and Richard was gone. The yacht was severely damaged, taking on water and drifting aimlessly in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. With no working radio, a broken navigation system, and limited supplies, she had to survive alone in the vast expanse of the ocean. Drawing on her sailing skills, Tammy fought to repair the damaged yacht. Despite her emotional and physical pain, she managed to rig a makeshift sail using the remnants of the storm-tattered equipment. She crafted a small jury rig to steer the disabled boat and used a sextant and a watch to roughly navigate, a task made infinitely more difficult without proper tools or charts. The next 41 days tested every ounce of Tammy's strength and courage. Battling dehydration, hunger, and despair, she rationed her limited supplies, often surviving on peanut butter and the few canned goods that had not been swept away. She collected rainwater whenever possible, drinking every drop as if it were the last. Alone on the sea, Tammy struggled not only against the physical elements, but also the grief for Richard. At times, she thought she saw him, heard him, and even spoke to him. Despite these challenges, Tammy's resolve never wavered. Each day, she checked her course, adjusted the sail, and kept moving forward. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Tommy spotted something she feared she would never see again: land. Exhausted and emaciated, she had managed to steer the broken yacht to the shores of Hilo, Hawaii. Ricky McGee. In January 2006, Ricky McGee set off on what was supposed to be a straightforward road trip to his new job in Port Hedland, Western Australia. The opportunity was too good to pass up, despite the daunting 42-hour drive from his home in Queensland through the rugged Australian outback. Confident in his Mitsubishi Challenger, Ricky began the journey, but what was supposed to be a fresh start soon turned into a nightmare. Ricky never made it to Port Hedland. Instead, he would spend the next 71 days stranded in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth, the Australian outback. What happened in those weeks has been the subject of much speculation, as Ricky's story changed multiple times over the years. McGee's early life was marked by tragedy. Born in the early 1970s in Gippsland, Victoria, his family relocated to Melbourne when he was young. His childhood was generally happy until his father took his own life, a loss that haunted Ricky into adulthood. He moved between different jobs, selling carpets, fishing for prawns, working as a nightclub security guard, and even training as an electrician. But none of these lasted long. Eventually, he became a bailiff, only to lose his position after a fight and subsequent arrest in Perth. His criminal record, which included drug charges, made finding stable work difficult. By 2006, at 35 years old, McGee was unemployed but had secured a position in Port Hedland. His drive took him along the desolate Bunteen Highway, a desert route through the outback. How exactly he ended up stranded remains a mystery. At first, Ricky told his rescuers that his car had broken down, but later changed his account to include being drugged by a hitchhiker. In his final version, detailed in his 2010 autobiography, he claimed that 3 strangers attacked and drugged him, leaving him unconscious. When he awoke, he was naked, covered in black plastic, and abandoned in the remote desert. With no food, water, or shelter, Ricky faced unimaginable odds. The outback is notorious for its extreme weather, from sweltering heat to freezing nights. The landscape offers little for survival, and many who go missing there are never found. For Ricky, survival became a test of willpower. He knew he had to find water to survive, and luckily, scattered pools left by recent rains were his saving grace. He built a shelter by a small dam, but food was still a problem. He resorted to eating anything he could find: lizards, frogs, leeches, and wild plants. As weeks turned into months, Ricky weakened. Starving and exhausted, he moved to another waterhole where he made peace with his situation, even crafting a makeshift cross in case the end came. On the 71st day, 2 jackaroos, or farmhands, found him near the Birindudu cattle station. McGee, now a walking skeleton, weighed just 105 pounds, having lost over half his body weight. Despite his harrowing experience, he was in surprisingly good shape, mostly due to staying hydrated. Though his ordeal was real, doubts linger over how he ended up in such a remote location. Ricky's car was never found, and his changing accounts fueled skepticism. Yet his survival story, whatever its origins, remains one of the most remarkable tales of endurance in Australian history. Joe Simpson. In 1985, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and his 21-year-old climbing partner Simon Yates attempted a daring alpine-style ascent of Ciula Grande, a 21,000-foot peak in the Peruvian Andes. Without guides, fixed ropes, or extra oxygen, they carried all their supplies, relying solely on each other and their skills. The climb began well, with the pair progressing steadily up the glacier. For 2 days, they alternated between climbing and resting in snow caves they dug each night. However, the closer they got to the 20,000-foot summit, the more dangerous the conditions became. Unstable snow slowed them, and by the time they summited on the 3rd day, both were physically exhausted and running low on supplies. The descent proved far more perilous. While attempting to navigate their way down the mountain, a snowstorm blinded their route, causing delays and near disasters. As the weather worsened, Joe slipped and fell, breaking his leg. This injury could have easily been fatal, as descending with a broken leg on such steep terrain was nearly impossible. Simon, knowing they were far from safety, chose to lower Joe using ropes in an effort to keep moving. This method of lowering Joe was slow and risky, but they made progress. Eventually, as night fell and visibility diminished, Simon accidentally lowered Joe over the edge of a cliff. Unable to see or hear Joe, and with Joe hanging helplessly in midair, Simon was forced to make a harrowing decision. After holding the weight for as long as possible, Simon cut the rope, believing Joe had fallen to his death. Joe, however, had fallen into a deep crevasse. Miraculously, he survived, but with a broken leg and severely limited mobility, his situation seemed hopeless. Joe found himself alone, cold, and in excruciating pain. With no sign of Simon and no food or water, Joe realized that he had to save himself or die trying. The next morning, after hours of yelling Simon's name with no response, Joe made the daring decision to lower himself deeper into the crevasse in search of an escape route. Amazingly, Joe spotted sunlight filtering through the ice and climbed toward it, despite the unbearable pain in his leg. After an agonizing crawl up the fragile ice, Joe emerged from the crevasse, but was faced with miles of treacherous glacier between him and safety. Undeterred, he set his sights on Simon's footprints in the snow and began dragging himself across the glacier, inch by inch, using his arms and uninjured leg to push forward. The journey was brutal. Night fell and snow began to cover Simon's tracks, erasing Joe's only guide. Weak, delirious, and freezing, Joe crawled through the night, desperately clinging to life. By the next morning, he could no longer see Simon's tracks, but he kept moving. Days had passed since his fall, and his body was deteriorating quickly. Meanwhile, Simon had made it back to base camp, where he met Richard, a friend they had brought along to watch the camp. Believing Joe was dead, Simon wrestled with guilt and exhaustion. Despite Richard urging him to leave and get help, Simon couldn't bring himself to abandon the camp. The weight of his decision to cut the rope haunted him. As Joe neared the base of the mountain, the terrain became rockier, making crawling impossible. Joe knew he had to stand, even on his shattered leg. In a desperate bid for survival, he began hopping over rocks, repeatedly falling but forcing himself to continue. He was now delirious, often passing out and waking disoriented. Finally, after days of agony, Joe reached the base camp's latrine, the strong smell cutting through his delirium. Overcome with emotion, he screamed Simon's name, hoping they hadn't left. At first, his cries went unanswered, but after a second scream, Simon and Richard realized the impossible. Joe was alive. Simon rushed out, and they found Joe, barely alive, having lost a third of his body weight and endured unimaginable suffering. Despite everything, Joe thanked Simon for trying to save him and reassured him that he would have done the same. But Simon's decision to cut the rope, though necessary, brought him lifelong guilt. Alvarenga and Cordoba. One quiet morning on the remote Iban Atoll in the Marshall Islands, a married couple, Russell and Emmy, were going about their usual work of drying coconuts when frantic shouts caught their attention. They rushed to the beach to find an unkempt man with a thick beard and long hair, dragging himself through the crashing surf. Iban Atoll was one of the most isolated places on Earth, far from anywhere you'd expect to find a visitor. At first, Russell and Emmy thought the man had fallen off a passing cargo ship. The truth, as they would soon learn, was much stranger. The man, speaking only Spanish, could not communicate with the couple, so they took him by boat to the main town on the atoll to seek help. Over the next few days, this stranger told a story almost too incredible to believe. The man was Jose Salvador Alvarenga, a fisherman who had gone missing off the coast of Mexico on November 17, 2012. He explained that he had been caught in a storm while fishing in a small boat and had been adrift for 438 days, surviving on fish, birds, and rainwater. Alvarenga's skiff was still bobbing in the surf nearby, further supporting his astonishing claim. Naturally, people were skeptical. His story gained international attention, and authorities grilled him, even administering a polygraph test. Survival experts, oceanographers, and adventurers analyzed his account and found it remarkably accurate. His boss back in Mexico confirmed that Alvarenga had indeed gone missing on the very day he claimed. As the pieces fell into place, the world had to accept the truth. Jose Salvador Alvarenga had survived one of the most improbable journeys in human history. Alvarenga's journey had begun as a simple 2-day fishing trip. His regular fishing partner canceled at the last minute, so 23-year-old Ezequiel Cordoba joined him. The weather started out fine, and they hauled in an impressive catch, but the weather quickly turned. A powerful storm hit, and for 5 days, the men battled the elements. Waves slammed their boat, and they were forced to toss their catch overboard to avoid capsizing. The storm destroyed their radio and GPS, leaving them stranded. Although Alvarenga managed to send out an SOS before the equipment died, rescue efforts failed to locate the tiny, powerless boat. For days they drifted with no food or water. Eventually they found ways to survive by catching fish and collecting rainwater. They also captured birds and even drank their blood when necessary. 4 months into the ordeal, Cordoba became ill after eating a poisoned seabird and tragically died. Heartbroken, Alvarenga was left completely alone for the next 10 months. He drifted across the Pacific, sometimes spotting distant ships, but no one ever saw him. Finally, in early 2014, Alvarenga's skiff washed ashore on Eban Atoll. Exhausted but alive, he had survived 438 days lost at sea, enduring one of the most remarkable feats of human survival ever recorded. Vesna Vulović. Vesna Vulovic's story is one of both survival and mystery, filled with incredible odds and a mix of emotions. Born in Belgrade in 1950, Vesna was an ordinary young woman with dreams of traveling the world. After a stint in the UK to study English, she returned to Serbia and was inspired by a friend to become a flight attendant. Despite having low blood pressure, she drank several cups of coffee to pass her medical exam and was accepted by Yugoslavia's national airline, JAT. On January 26, 1972, Vesna's life changed forever when she boarded JAT Flight 367. The flight was scheduled to fly from Stockholm to Belgrade, with stops in Copenhagen and Zagreb. Vesna was part of the replacement crew, boarding the plane in Copenhagen for the final leg of the journey. As the plane took off, everything seemed normal until, at around 4 p.m., an explosion tore through the aircraft while it was flying over Czechoslovakia. The plane disintegrated mid-air, and debris rained down onto a snowy forest. Vesna was the sole survivor of the crash. She was found alive by Bruno Hanke, a former World War II medic who was nearby, and heard her screams from the wreckage. Vesna was discovered in the tail section of the plane, pinned by a food cart, which may have shielded her from being sucked out of the aircraft. Being in the tail section helped cushion the fall, and the snow-covered forest provided additional softening. Doctors believed Vesna's low blood pressure saved her life, as it caused her to pass out quickly and prevented her heart from failing during the fall. Her survival, however, came at a heavy cost. She sustained multiple injuries, including broken legs, a fractured skull, and a shattered spine. Initially paralyzed, Vesna eventually regained the ability to walk after months of rehabilitation. Vesna's survival story made her an instant celebrity. She was celebrated by Yugoslavia's leader, Tito, and became the holder of the Guinness World Record for the highest fall without a parachute. She received honors, and her fame grew internationally. However, despite the external glory, Vesna struggled with the emotional aftermath of the accident. She experienced survivor's guilt, often wondering why she lived when 27 others on the flight did not. In later years, she expressed her belief that a passenger who angrily left the plane in Copenhagen might have been responsible for planting the bomb that caused the explosion. Croatian nationalists claimed responsibility for the bombing, but no one was ever charged. Vesna Vulović lived the rest of her life quietly, avoiding public attention. She passed away in 2016 at the age of 66 in her Belgrade apartment. Ada Blackjack. Ada Blackjack, born Ada Telejic in 1898 in Spruce Creek, Alaska, was an Inupiat woman who lived an extraordinary life. Though raised by Methodist missionaries, she did not learn the traditional survival skills of her people. Instead, she was taught English, the Bible, and housekeeping skills. At 16, Ada married a dog musher named Jack Blackjack, with whom she had 3 children, though only one survived infancy, a son named Bennett. In 1921, Jack abandoned Ada and Bennett in the harsh wilderness of Alaska, leaving Ada to walk 40 miles to safety with her ill son. Bennett suffered from tuberculosis, and Ada, unable to care for him, had to place him in an orphanage temporarily. Devastated, she vowed to work hard to save enough money to bring him home. Later that year, Ada learned of an expedition led by Arctic explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson to colonize Wrangel Island. Although the Canadian and British governments declined to support the mission, Stephenson assembled a team of 4 men: Alan Crawford, Fred Moorer, Milton Gall, and Lorne Knight. Ada was recruited as the team's seamstress, offered $50 per month to sew survival gear during the 1-year mission. Desperate to earn money to care for her son, Ada reluctantly joined, despite her fears. On September 9, 1921, the group set off for Wrangel Island, and after a week at sea, they arrived. They planted the British flag as instructed by Stephenson, despite the island being Russian territory. However, things quickly went awry. The team's sled dogs were weak, and much of their food had spoiled. Still, they remained hopeful, trusting Stephenson's assurance that the island had ample game. The harsh Arctic environment soon took its toll. Ada struggled with homesickness and fear of polar bears, even developing Arctic hysteria, but she eventually pulled through. As the polar night set in, the group faced freezing temperatures and dwindling food supplies. In January 1923, with Knight gravely ill from scurvy and their stores nearly depleted, Crawford, Moorer, and Gale set out to seek help, leaving Ada behind to care for Knight. The men were never seen again. Alone with Knight and a cat named Vic, Ada did her best to care for the sick man, though he frequently mistreated her. Despite this, Ada hunted, trapped foxes, and maintained the camp. Knight's health continued to deteriorate, and he died in June 1923. Ada recorded his death and continued her solitary existence, improving her hunting and survival skills. On August 10, 1923, nearly 2 years after their arrival, Ada was rescued by a team led by Harold Noyce. She was hailed as the female Robinson Crusoe, but the media attention was unwanted. Ada was finally reunited with her son, though her later years were marked by poverty and sadness. She lived a quiet life in Alaska and passed away in 1983 at the age of 85. The Donner Party. The Donner Party's tragic westward journey is one of the most infamous tales from the era of westward expansion, particularly during the California Gold Rush. In 1846, this group of pioneers, led by brothers George and Jacob Donner along with their friend James Reed, set out to reach California. Unfortunately, their journey turned into a nightmare, one marked by delays, poor decisions, and a devastating end where survival meant resorting to cannibalism. One of the first critical mistakes the Donner Party made was starting their journey too late in the season. The ideal time for pioneers to head west was in mid-April, giving them ample time to cross the plains before the harsh winter set in. The Donner Party, however, didn't begin their trek until May 12th. While this month-long delay might seem insignificant, it would prove disastrous when they reached the treacherous Sierra Nevada mountains. Early into the journey, they faced their first obstacle, the Big Blue River, swollen by heavy rains. The river, which cut through parts of Nebraska and Kansas, had risen over 20 feet, delaying their progress. The group spent days building rafts to ferry their wagons across the raging waters. Tragically, Sarah Keyes, an elderly member of the party, succumbed to tuberculosis before they could move on. Another miscalculation came with their food supply. They packed enough food to last about 4 months, which would have been sufficient if everything had gone according to plan. However, unforeseen delays stretched the journey, and their meager provisions of flour, meat, and basic staples like beans and cornmeal soon dwindled. As their journey dragged on, hunger became a constant companion. Perhaps their most fatal decision was choosing to take an untested route known as the Hastings Cutoff. Lansford Hastings, an ambitious promoter of westward expansion, had written a guidebook that promised this shortcut would shave off 300 miles from the trip to California. Although the party was warned by an experienced traveler, James Kleiman, that the Hastings Cutoff was nearly impassable, they ignored his advice and decided to gamble on the supposedly quicker route. Unbeknownst to them, Hastings himself had never even taken the route with wagons, and the path was fraught with dangers. Their troubles compounded when they reached the Great Salt Desert. Crossing the desert was a grueling ordeal, as wagons became stuck in the sand and oxen weakened from thirst and exhaustion. Many of the animals were left to die or fled, further depleting the party's resources. As if this weren't enough, Their cattle were frequently stolen by Native American tribes, reducing their already scarce food supply. By the time the Donner Party reached the Sierra Nevada in late October, an early snowstorm trapped them. With their path blocked, the group had no choice but to set up camp and wait out the winter. As their food supply ran out, they initially survived by eating cow hides and bones, but eventually they were forced to cannibalize those who had died. In the end, only 48 of the original 87 members of the Donner Party survived to reach California. Phineas Gage. Born in 1823 in Vermont, he was a railroad construction foreman known for his hard-working nature and strong character. Gage was a familiar figure in his community, often described as energetic, ambitious, and well-liked by his peers. His life took a dramatic turn on September 13, 1848, when he experienced an accident that would change not only his life, but also the field of psychology forever. On that fateful day, Gage and his crew were working on the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. They were tasked with blasting rock to clear a path for the railway. As was common practice, Gage prepared a hole for the explosive charge using a tamping iron, a long, heavy iron rod. Unfortunately, while he was packing the powder, he accidentally caused a spark, igniting the explosive. In a split second, the tamping iron was propelled through his skull, entering below his left cheekbone, and exiting through the top of his head. The rod, measuring nearly 3 feet long and weighing 13 pounds, flew over 30 yards away. Miraculously, Gage survived the accident. His fellow workers, initially horrified, rushed him to the nearest doctor, where they feared the worst. However, Gage remained conscious and coherent. He was able to speak, and despite the severity of his injury, he seemed to retain his memory and cognitive abilities. The doctors worked to clean the wounds and tend to his injuries, but they could hardly have imagined the profound impact this event would have on his life and science. In the weeks following the accident, Gage's recovery was remarkable. However, it soon became clear that he was not the same man he once was. The damage to his frontal lobes, critical areas of the brain responsible for personality, decision-making, and social behavior, resulted in drastic changes to his character. He became impulsive, irritable, and irresponsible, often engaging in behavior that shocked his friends and family. Gage, who had once been a responsible foreman, found it difficult to hold down a job, and his relationships deteriorated as those close to him struggled to understand the man he had become. After several years of wandering and searching for a new purpose, Gage eventually moved to San Francisco, where he found work in a livery stable. Although he continued to experience challenges, he managed to build a new life for himself, engaging with the community and finding moments of joy amid his struggles. Gage passed away in 1860 at the age of 36. Lincoln Hall. Lincoln Hall was a climber celebrated for his mountaineering skills, yet only marginally known as an author despite having written several books. His story of survival on Mount Everest is nothing short of miraculous. In 2006, at the age of 56, Hall attempted to summit Everest once again, more than 2 decades after his first, unsuccessful attempt. Little did he know that this climb would lead him to one of the most harrowing survival experiences ever recorded. Hall began rock climbing at the age of 15 and was quickly captivated by the challenges of the sport. His love for climbing took him to the heights of New Zealand, the Andes, and beyond. He even became part of the first Australian Everest team in 1984, although he narrowly missed reaching the summit. Over the years, Hall continued to climb and wrote several mountaineering books, with his most famous being White Limbo, a classic in the genre. He lived with his wife Barbara and 2 sons, Dylan and George, in New South Wales, Australia. In 2006, Hall was invited by Sherpa guides to make another attempt at Everest, and after years of hesitation, he accepted the challenge. However, the climb was fraught with difficulty. Hall and his team received grim news as they approached the summit. Several climbers had perished along the way, including British climber David Sharp, who died only 300 meters from the top. Sharp's death weighed heavily on Hall's mind, adding a sense of dread to his own journey. Despite these ominous signs, Hall successfully reached the summit of Everest. But on his descent, he was struck by cerebral edema, a severe swelling of the brain that caused him to hallucinate and collapse. His Sherpa guides worked tirelessly to save him, but after hours of effort and no response, they believed him to be dead. They reluctantly left him behind to save themselves, reporting his death to Hall's family. For 12 hours, Lincoln Hall lay in what is known as the death zone, a region so high that the oxygen is too thin to sustain human life. Most climbers who remain there for long periods do not survive. Yet against all odds, Hall did. The next morning, climber Dan Mazur and his team found him, alive but severely frostbitten and disoriented. When they approached him, Hall greeted them with surprising calm, saying, "I imagine you're surprised to see me." Hall's survival was remarkable. He had spent the night without oxygen, proper clothing, or shelter in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Driven by the thought of his family, he refused to give in to death. After being rescued, Hall was able to speak to his wife and eventually made a long and arduous descent to safety. Despite surviving Everest, Hall's life ended in 2012 due to mesothelioma, a disease linked to asbestos exposure in his childhood. But his legacy as the man who cheated death on Everest lives on, with his gear displayed in the Australian National Museum. Debbie Kiley. Deborah, an experienced sailor born in Texas in 1958, had grown up around boats, honing her skills from a young age. By 25, she had already completed the prestigious Whitbread Round-the-World race, a remarkable achievement. She was part of a 5-person crew aboard the 58-foot yacht, the Trashman, hired to sail from Maine to Florida. The journey was expected to take 6 days. The crew was in high spirits as they departed, enjoying favorable weather on the first leg of the trip. But the calm was short-lived. After stopping in Annapolis, Maryland, they set off again, only to encounter a powerful tropical storm off the coast of North Carolina. The waves surged to 30 to 50 feet, and the wind howled at 70 miles per hour. The captain, John Lippeth, had been drinking heavily and fell asleep at the helm as the boat began to take on water. Deborah awoke in the middle of the night to find chaos. The boat was flooding, and the crew was in a panic. As the vessel capsized, the crew scrambled to inflate a small life raft. Deborah, along with crewmates Brad Kavanaugh, Mark Adams, and Meg Mooney, managed to climb into the raft, but they were now stranded in shark-infested waters. To make matters worse, Meg had suffered a deep cut on her leg, and the smell of blood attracted a frenzy of sharks. The group watched in horror as dozens of sharks circled their raft, bumping against it, seemingly waiting for the right moment. Days passed, and the crew's situation worsened. Without food or fresh water, they grew weak and dehydrated. Meg's wound became infected, and she began to suffer from blood poisoning. The infection spread rapidly, causing her to hallucinate. John, too, became delusional from dehydration, and in a fit of madness, he jumped overboard, mistakenly believing he could swim to land. The sharks got to him within moments. As the days dragged on, the surviving crew members struggled to stay alive. Mark succumbed to the same delusions as John, throwing himself into the sea, where the sharks claimed him. Meg's infection finally overcame her, and she died on the raft. Deborah and Brad, the last 2 survivors, were forced to make the heartbreaking decision to cast Meg's body into the ocean. In a miraculous turn of events, a Russian cargo ship spotted their small raft and rescued them after 5 grueling days at sea. Though Deborah survived, the ordeal left a lasting impact. She went on to share her story through motivational speaking and her book, Albatross, before passing away in 2012. Bear Grylls' freefall incident. Bear Grylls, known worldwide for his survival skills in television shows, experienced his own terrifying brush with death in 1996 when a routine parachute jump went horribly wrong. At the time, Grylls was serving with the British Special Air Service and was undergoing advanced parachute training. The incident that nearly claimed his life left him with a broken back and put his future in jeopardy, but also helped shape his enduring reputation as a man of resilience and grit. During a routine jump over southern Africa, Grylls was performing a free-fall parachute exercise from 16,000 feet. In such exercises, parachutists fall for several seconds before deploying their parachutes. However, on this particular jump, things did not go as planned. As Grylls pulled his parachute ripcord, the main chute failed to open correctly. It only partially deployed, causing a canopy collapse, a terrifying situation where the parachute becomes tangled or twisted, severely impairing its ability to slow the descent. With the main chute malfunctioning, Grills was forced to deploy his reserve parachute. But by then, it was too late to avoid disaster. He was still falling at a dangerous speed and had very little time to correct the situation. His body slammed into the desert floor with tremendous force, and the impact was catastrophic. Grills immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The force of the fall had crushed 3 vertebrae in his back. Although conscious, he was left paralyzed and in excruciating pain. His SAS colleagues and emergency responders rushed to his aid, stabilizing him before transporting him to a hospital. The injury was severe, and doctors told him that he was lucky to have survived the fall at all. They warned him that he might never walk again, let alone return to the active, adventurous life he had always known. For months, Grills was confined to bed, his body held together by metal braces. The injury had fractured his T8, T10, and T12 vertebrae, which are crucial for movement and support. The recovery process was grueling and uncertain. It took time for Grills to regain feeling and movement in his lower body, and his future as a soldier and adventurer seemed bleak. But Bear Grylls refused to give up. With a combination of determination, physical therapy, and a positive mindset, he fought his way back to health. Within 18 months of the accident, he achieved a seemingly impossible goal. Grills climbed Mount Everest in 1998 at the age of 23, becoming one of the youngest Britons ever to reach the summit. This remarkable feat, just 2 years after an injury that had nearly left him paralyzed, even further proved his reputation as someone with extraordinary physical and mental resilience. Ernest Shackleton. In 1914, Sir Ernest Shackleton, a seasoned polar explorer, set his sights on a daring new challenge, to be the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent. Though Shackleton had previously led 2 major Antarctic expeditions, his ambitions were stoked by the knowledge that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had already claimed the prize of reaching the South Pole in 1911. Shackleton's new goal, the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, would involve 2 parties and 2 ships. One party, led by Shackleton, would sail aboard the Endurance to the Weddell Sea, while the other, aboard the Aurora, would lay supply depots on the opposite side of the continent. The Endurance, a sturdy 300-ton vessel originally designed for Arctic cruises, set sail in August 1914, just after the outbreak of World War I. Despite concerns, Shackleton received orders from Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, to continue with the expedition. After several months of preparation and stops in Buenos Aires and South Georgia, Shackleton and his crew began their Antarctic voyage in December 1914. Early into the journey, they encountered pack ice far north of where Shackleton had expected. The Endurance struggled to make progress through the dense ice, and by January 1915, it was halted just 200 miles from their intended landing site. Trapped by thick ice floes, the ship became immobilized. Attempts to free the vessel proved fruitless, and Shackleton ultimately decided to extinguish the ship's boilers, allowing it to drift with the ice. For the next several months, the crew of the Endurance settled into life aboard the trapped ship, passing the harsh Antarctic winter by exercising on the ice and keeping spirits up with celebrations and music. However, as winter turned to spring, the ice began to shift and press against the ship with alarming force. By late October, the Endurance had suffered significant damage, and water began flooding in. On October 24, 1915, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The crew, now stranded on the ice, established a camp and salvaged what supplies they could from the sinking Endurance. As the ship finally slipped beneath the ice in November, the men faced a new challenge: survival. Attempts to drag lifeboats northward across the ice proved too difficult, and Shackleton and his men were forced to camp on the ice, subsisting on seal meat and waiting for an opportunity to escape. By April 1916, the drifting ice had brought them close to Elephant Island, a remote and desolate landmass. Launching their lifeboats, the men made it to solid ground for the first time in nearly 500 days. But Shackleton knew they couldn't survive there indefinitely. On April 24th, he and 5 others set out in a lifeboat for South Georgia, navigating 800 miles of treacherous ocean. After 2 weeks at sea, they miraculously reached South Georgia. Shackleton then led a dangerous overland trek to a whaling station, where they finally secured help. After multiple rescue attempts, the rest of the crew was saved in August 1916. Against all odds, all 28 members of the expedition survived. Louis Zamperini. Louis Zamperini's life story is one of incredible resilience, faith, and transformation. Born to Italian immigrants, Louis grew up as a rebellious boy in California, but found his calling in running. His talent eventually led him to compete in the 1936 Berlin Olympics as a distance runner. However, his life took a dramatic turn when World War II broke out. During the war, Zamperini served as a bombardier on a B-24 Liberator. In May 1943, during a search and rescue mission over the Pacific, his plane malfunctioned and crashed into the ocean. Of the 11 crew members, only Louis, the pilot Russell Allen Phillips, and the tail gunner Francis McNamara survived. They were left stranded on a small raft in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. For 47 days, they battled starvation, dehydration, and shark attacks, drifting thousands of miles. Tragically, McNamara did not survive the ordeal, succumbing to the harsh conditions after 33 days. In those desperate moments, despite not being religious, Louis found himself turning to prayer. He promised God that if he survived, he would dedicate his life to serving him. On the 47th day, Louis and Phillips were captured by a Japanese patrol and taken to a series of brutal prisoner-of-war camps. For the next 2 years, Zamperini faced unimaginable suffering. He endured beatings, starvation, and daily humiliation. One of the most notorious figures in his story was Mutsuhiro Watanabe, a prison guard known as the Bird, who took a particular interest in tormenting Louis. Watanabe's cruelty was extreme, and he subjected Louis and other prisoners to relentless abuse, leaving them physically and emotionally broken. Despite being liberated at the end of the war, Louis's battle was far from over. He returned home a hero, but struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares of Watanabe haunted him, and his heart was filled with anger and a desire for revenge. To cope, Louis turned to alcohol, which strained his marriage to his wife Cynthia. At the brink of divorce, Cynthia invited Louis to attend a Billy Graham crusade in 1949. There, Louis had a spiritual awakening. He remembered the promise he had made to God on the raft and chose to forgive his enemies, including Watanabe. This decision transformed Louis' life. His nightmares ceased, and he replaced his hatred with forgiveness. In 1952, Louis even traveled to Japan to forgive his former captors, though he never got to meet Watanabe, who had gone into hiding. Despite never confronting Watanabe face-to-face, Louis wrote him a letter offering his forgiveness and urging him to find peace in God. In his later years, Louis became a Christian speaker and founded the Victory Boys Camp to help troubled youth. His story of survival, faith, and forgiveness inspired millions. Louis Zamperini passed away in 2014 at the age of 97, but his legacy lives on through books, films, and the countless lives he touched. Douglas Mawson. In November 1912, a 3-man team embarked on a dangerous expedition across the unexplored wilderness of Antarctica. The journey would soon become one of the most harrowing tales of polar exploration. This is the story of the Australasian Antarctic expedition led by Douglas Mawson. In December 1911, geologist and polar explorer Douglas Mawson set sail from Australia on the ship Aurora with a team of 31 men. They aimed to explore a largely uncharted section of the Antarctic continent and carry out scientific research. Mawson was no stranger to the harsh conditions of Antarctica, having previously joined Ernest Shackleton's British Antarctic expedition from 1907 to 1909. Mawson's expertise and survival skills earned him a reputation as a seasoned explorer, but his new mission would test him like never before. After setting up a base at Cape Denison on the remote Commonwealth Bay in January 1912, the team endured fierce winds, sometimes reaching speeds of 240 kilometers per hour. Despite these extreme conditions, they managed to build a hut that still stands today. Mawson and his team spent months preparing for land expeditions into the continent's interior to conduct scientific studies, including an attempt to reach the South Magnetic Pole. In November 1912, Mawson and 2 companions, Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis, a British Army officer and dog handler, and Xavier Mertz, a Swiss cross-country skier, set out on what would later be known as the Far Eastern Shore Party. They planned to survey glaciers far from their base, hauling heavy loads of gear across treacherous, crevasse-filled ice fields. At first, the team made good progress, covering 480 kilometers by mid-December. But disaster struck on December 14th. As they crossed an ice field, Ninnis and several of the expedition's strongest dogs suddenly plunged into a concealed crevasse, falling to their deaths. Along with them went most of the group's supplies, including their main tent and nearly all their food. Stranded hundreds of kilometers from base with only 10 days' worth of rations, Mawson and Mertz faced an impossible task, surviving the trek back. They resorted to killing and eating their remaining dogs, but even this wasn't enough. Mertz, already weakened by the toxic effects of consuming too much dog liver, began to deteriorate rapidly. By January 7, 1913, he was delirious and suffering from terrible physical symptoms. He died the next morning. Now alone, Mawson faced a daunting 160-kilometer journey back to base, battling extreme conditions. At one point, he fell into a crevasse but miraculously survived. Day by day, he dragged himself forward, even fashioning a rope ladder in case of future falls. On January 29th, Mawson finally spotted signs of help, a note left by his teammates with food and supplies. He reached Aladdin's Cave, a nearby outpost, and later made it back to base camp. By then, the expedition's ship had already left for Australia, forcing Mawson to spend another winter in Antarctica. Despite this, his expedition was considered a scientific success, and upon his return, he was knighted for his contributions to Antarctic exploration. Chilean miners. The collapse of the San Jose mine in Chile in 2010 was a harrowing event that gripped the world for more than 2 months. On August 5th, 33 miners began what they thought would be a routine 12-hour shift, working deep within the mine's corridors. Their supervisor, Luis Urzua, led them to a spot nearly 2,300 feet beneath the Earth's surface, surrounded by the deafening sounds of drills as they chipped away at the earth, searching for copper and gold. Suddenly, an ominous rumble filled the air, followed by a powerful explosion. A massive boulder broke free and cascaded through the mine, causing the mountain above them to collapse. Dust clouded the tunnels, and in an instant, the miners found themselves trapped, cut off from the entrance by tons of fallen rock. They were alive but sealed in complete darkness, their exit routes blocked, and only a small supply of food and water at hand. Panic surged through the group, but Urzua quickly took charge, guiding the men to a safer area with better ventilation. Their first hope for escape was through the ventilation shafts, but when they reached them, they discovered a devastating oversight. The mine's owners had neglected to install ladders. Trapped and without a clear escape route, the miners' hopes dwindled. Over the next few days, the mine suffered another collapse, further sealing their fate. On the surface, rescue teams rushed to the scene, but they faced a daunting task, breaching a stone block weighing over 770,000 tons. The situation looked grim, and many feared that no one inside the mine could have survived the collapse. Nevertheless, the Chilean government made the miners' rescue their top priority. The state-owned mining company Codelco took over the operation, sending in experts to assess the situation. Days stretched into weeks with no sign of life. Rescue teams drilled exploratory boreholes, desperately trying to locate the men. Then, after 17 long days, one of the drill bits broke through into the cavern where the miners were trapped. From below, they heard the tap-tap of miners signaling their location. A note was soon pulled up attached to the drill. All 33 of us are fine in the shelter. Relief flooded through the rescue team, but the operation to bring the men back to the surface was far from over. They still needed to create a passage wide enough for the miners to be pulled out one by one. Drilling a tunnel through the unstable rock would take weeks. Inside the mine, Urzua had been managing the men's survival, rationing food to 2 spoons of tuna and half a glass of milk every 48 hours. Despite the dire circumstances, the men maintained their discipline, relying on one another and the leadership of their supervisor. On October 12th, the first miner, Florencio Avalos, ascended to the surface. He was greeted by the cheers of a nation and the world, as Chile's national anthem played in the background. One by one, the miners were pulled to safety. The last to emerge was Urzua, the man who had led his team through 69 days of unimaginable hardship, bringing their harrowing ordeal to an end. Though the world celebrated their survival, the scars of the experience would stay with many of the miners for the rest of their lives. Terry Jo Duperot. In 1961, a seemingly innocent family vacation turned into one of the most shocking maritime mysteries in history. The image of a young girl sitting alone on a life raft after spending 4 harrowing days adrift in the ocean would come to symbolize her unimaginable ordeal. But behind this image lay an even darker truth. The Duperot family, Arthur, Jean, their 3 children, Brian, Renee, and Terry Jo, were a happy and adventurous family from Wisconsin. Arthur, an optometrist, had long dreamed of taking his family on a sailing trip to the Bahamas. In November 1961, he chartered the 60-foot sailing ketch Bluebell for a week-long cruise, hiring an experienced captain named Julian Harvey. Harvey, a World War II veteran, brought along his wife, Mary Danae, for what seemed like an idyllic voyage. For several days, the Duperots enjoyed the Bahamas, snorkeling and exploring the islands. But as they began their return journey to Florida, everything changed. On the night of November 12th, chaos erupted aboard the Bluebell. Terry Jo was woken by the sound of her brother Brian screaming. When she ventured out of her cabin, she was met with the horrifying sight of her mother and brother lying in pools of blood on the deck. Julian Harvey, eyes wild, appeared and shoved her back down below. Unbeknownst to Terry Jo, Harvey had murdered her family. He had planned to sink the ship to cover up the crime, possibly motivated by financial troubles and a desire to collect his wife's life insurance policy. After setting the boat ablaze and scuttling it, Harvey abandoned ship in a dinghy, leaving Terry Jo to drown as the Bluebell sank. But Terry Jo was resilient. As the boat began to submerge, she managed to free a small cork life raft and cling to it as the ship disappeared beneath the waves. Alone in the vast ocean with no food or water, she drifted for days, her skin blistering under the scorching sun, her feet bleeding from the sharp bites of fish through the bottom of the raft. On November 16th, a Greek freighter spotted something unusual on the water, a lone life raft bobbing among the waves. Aboard it was the nearly lifeless body of Terry Jo, who had miraculously survived her ordeal. Rescuers were astounded that she had endured such extreme conditions. Meanwhile, Julian Harvey had already been rescued days earlier, weaving a tale about a violent storm sinking the Bluebell. But when news of Terry Jo's survival reached him during his interrogation by the Coast Guard, he panicked. The next morning, Harvey was found dead in a Miami hotel room, having taken his own life. Once she regained consciousness, Terry Jo recounted the horrific events aboard the Bluebell, revealing Harvey's heinous actions. Her testimony closed the case on what had really happened that fateful night. USS Indianapolis. In July 1945, the USS Indianapolis completed a mission that would forever change the course of history. It had successfully delivered components for the first operational atomic bomb, Little Boy, to the island of Tinian, just days before it would be dropped on Hiroshima. On the night of July 30th, 1945, after completing its mission, the USS Indianapolis was en route to the Philippines when disaster struck. A Japanese submarine lurking in the depths launched 2 torpedoes at the ship, striking it with deadly precision. The Indianapolis was split in 2 and began to sink at an alarming rate. The order to abandon ship was given, but many didn't make it out in time. Within 12 minutes, the giant vessel had disappeared beneath the waves, taking around 300 sailors down with it. Roughly 900 survivors, thrown into the chaos of the sea, found themselves floating in open water, unaware that their struggle had only just begun. Despite their desperate situation, the Navy failed to respond to distress signals sent out by the crew. For reasons that remain unclear, the SOS calls were ignored, and no one realized the ship had gone missing. The sea was teeming with sharks. As the survivors clung to life, some without life jackets, they were left to fend off sharks while battling the elements. Injuries sustained during the torpedo attack were left untreated, and the men were covered in fuel leaking from the wreckage. It wasn't long before blood began to fill the water, drawing in more predators. As the men floated helplessly, trying to stay in groups, the sharks circled them. Any sailor who drifted away from the others became easy prey, and soon the air was filled with the agonizing screams of those being pulled beneath the waves. Sharks bumped against the sailors, sometimes seemingly taunting them before delivering their fatal strikes. The survivors, utterly powerless, could only watch as their comrades were taken one by one. Days passed without rescue, and the survivors faced additional challenges: thirst, starvation, and delirium. Some succumbed to the temptation of drinking salt water, which led to hallucinations and death. Others simply drowned as their waterlogged life vests failed to keep them afloat. Still, the sharks remained a constant threat. It wasn't until almost 5 days later that the men were accidentally discovered by a patrol plane. The sight of the survivors prompted a swift rescue operation, but by the time help arrived, only 317 of the original 879 sailors survived. The rest had perished, victims of the sea, the elements, and the relentless sharks. The tragedy of the USS Indianapolis left the nation in shock, and though it was initially kept secret due to the ship's role in delivering atomic bomb components, the truth eventually came to light. The Balsrud story. In March 1943, deep within the Arctic Circle, Norwegian commando Jan Balsrud found himself fighting for survival in the icy waters of Tuftefjord Bay. His team's vessel, the Brattholm, had been attacked by Nazi forces, sending him and his 11 companions into chaos. As gunfire and screams filled the air, a towering pillar of smoke from the burning boat blocked out the sun. While Gestapo agents captured most of his comrades, dragging them from the freezing water to their likely death, John and one other managed to reach the shore. Barely able to stand from the cold and terror, Jan and his companions struggled on, knowing that being caught would mean torture and death. But tragedy soon struck again. A bullet from a Nazi rifle killed Jan's last ally, leaving him utterly alone. He had no time to grieve, only the drive to survive. His soaked uniform clung to him like a shroud, and one of his boots had been lost in the water. As the sound of marching boots and angry German voices approached, Jan knew he had little time. His weapon, a small Colt pistol, was his only defense against the well-armed Gestapo patrol that was closing in. Despite the overwhelming odds, Jan made his choice. He aimed his pistol at the advancing enemy, but his first attempt to fire resulted in nothing but a jammed gun. Desperately, he cleared the weapon, tossed aside the malfunctioning rounds, and fired again. To his relief, one shot struck a Nazi soldier, killing him instantly, while another bullet wounded a second, throwing the patrol into disarray. Using this moment of panic, Jan fled into the nearby hills with only one boot, a freezing uniform, and 4 remaining bullets in his magazine. Jan's harrowing escape had only just begun. Over the next 3 months, he would rely on the help of brave Norwegians who risked their lives to protect him from the Gestapo. The first of these was the Edrupson family, who, despite knowing the danger, sheltered the freezing and delirious commando. Jan, weighed down with guilt over the risk he brought to these families, developed a system to keep them safe. He never told any host where he had been or where he was going next, ensuring that no one could betray the others if caught. Jan's journey was marked by constant suffering. His feet, exposed to freezing temperatures, were ravaged by frostbite, threatening gangrene. He walked through blizzards, barely nourished, and even suffered snow blindness. Despite these hardships, kind locals continued to aid him. A father grieving the loss of his son rowed Jan across dangerous waters. A fisherman gave him skis, and a family hid him in their barn while he recovered. In a makeshift shelter, Jan took the horrifying step of amputating his own frostbitten toes using only a pocket knife, a decision that saved his foot from further infection. Despite the near-constant threat of death from either the elements or the pursuing Nazis, Jan pressed on. Eventually, with the help of Norwegian resistance members and the indigenous Sami people, Jan crossed into neutral Sweden. Starved and frostbitten, he weighed just 80 pounds when he was finally rescued. Though the war had taken a heavy toll on him, Jan continued to serve, training other soldiers and fighting for Norway until the end of the conflict. He returned home a hero, living out the rest of his days as a symbol of resistance and survival, before passing away in 1988 at the age of 71. James Scott. A few decades ago, backpacking through remote areas of Asia meant truly disconnecting from the world. There were no smartphones or GPS, no instant contact with friends or family. Adventurers were practically cut off from everything familiar, venturing into the unknown. This was the case for a man named James Scott, who in 1991 embarked on a journey from Australia to Nepal at just 23 years old. He wasn't seeking a casual vacation. His plan was to work in a hospital in Kathmandu before trekking through the Himalayan mountains. James was in great physical shape, having practiced karate for 6 years, and his mental resilience would soon prove to be just as important. After completing his work at the hospital, James and a fellow medical student set off into the mountains, unaware of the peril that lay ahead. Late December in the Himalayas is one of the coldest and most dangerous times to trek, with freezing temperatures and treacherous, ice-covered paths. The two travelers soon found themselves caught in a brutal blizzard. James realized the danger and urged his friend to turn back. They disagreed, and James chose to go on alone. What followed was a nightmare. Armed with only a few supplies, a couple of chocolate bars, some warm clothes, and a handful of books, James was soon lost in the vast snow-covered wilderness. He wandered for days, hoping to find a way back to safety, but the brutal terrain only made things worse. Eventually, he found himself stranded, unable to go forward or back. His family, now alerted to his disappearance, feared the worst. Days turned into weeks, and James was forced to shelter in a makeshift ice cave, surviving on melted snow and the last remnants of his chocolate bars. As his body weakened, he held on to hope, envisioning rescue despite the overwhelming odds. After 40 days of isolation and near starvation, James had given up. His body was too weak to move, and death seemed inevitable. Then, on the 43rd day, a miracle happened. A helicopter, piloted by an expert mountaineer, spotted him. James, too weak to even stand, crawled out of his shelter, waving a sleeping bag to signal his presence. Though the helicopter couldn't land right away, local Nepalese men later found him. They couldn't believe their eyes. No one had ever survived that long in such conditions. James Scott was rescued, malnourished but alive. His survival defied all odds, earning him the nickname the Iceman. Despite the lasting effects on his health, he emerged from the ordeal with a new perspective. No difficulty is impossible to overcome, he later said. And in the end, James proved that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the human spirit can triumph. The whale ship Essex. In the early 19th century, the Essex, a well-worn whaling ship from Nantucket, set sail for the South Pacific. At the time, Nantucket was the heart of the whaling industry, supplying whale oil to fuel the Industrial Revolution. The Essex, captained by George Pollard, Jr., embarked on what was expected to be a 2 to 3 year voyage in August 1819. However, the journey seemed cursed from the start. Just days after setting sail, a storm nearly sank the ship, damaging 2 of the 5 smaller whaling boats. Despite concerns from the crew, Pollard pressed on. Months passed with little success. The crew struggled to find whales, and one member even deserted in Ecuador, sensing the bad luck following the Essex. The crew then learned of a promising new whaling ground 2,500 miles away. Eager to make up for lost time, Pollard steered the ship toward the distant location. Along the way, they stopped at the Galapagos Islands, where they gathered 360 tortoises as provisions for the long journey ahead. In a careless act, they accidentally set a fire that ravaged the island's flora and fauna before leaving in haste. On November 20th, 1820, after over a year at sea, the Essex finally reached the promising whaling grounds. The crew eagerly chased a large pod of sperm whales. Whaling was brutal, requiring sailors to row close to the whales and harpoon them, leading to dangerous Nantucket sleigh rides as the whales dragged the boats at high speeds. However, one massive sperm whale wasn't willing to go down without a fight. At 26 meters long and weighing around 80 tons, this whale rammed the Essex twice, causing catastrophic damage. As water rushed into the ship, the crew scrambled to salvage supplies before the Essex sank. They managed to gather some tortoises, 65 gallons of water, and 600 pounds of hardtack, an unappetizing, salt-infused biscuit. The closest islands were 1,200 miles away, but the crew feared these were inhabited by cannibals, so they opted to sail toward Chile, thousands of miles further but considered safer. This choice left them with little room for error. Weeks passed in the tiny whaling boats as they battled dehydration, hunger, and sunburn. Their bread was tainted with seawater, worsening their thirst. Eventually, they stumbled upon the uninhabited Henderson Island. Initially hopeful, they soon realized the island had little to offer except for a few birds, crabs, and sparse vegetation. 3 men chose to remain on the island, while the rest, driven by desperation, set sail once more. As the weeks dragged on, supplies ran out completely. Starvation loomed, and the crew faced an unthinkable decision. When Matthew Joy, one of the sailors, died from illness, the survivors, overcome by hunger, resorted to cannibalism, the very fate they had tried so hard to avoid. One by one, more crew members perished, and the survivors were forced to consume the bodies of their fallen comrades to stay alive. By the time they were rescued in February 1821, after more than 90 days at sea, only 8 men from the original crew of 20 had survived. Their story of survival, shipwreck, and cannibalism shocked the world and became one of the most infamous maritime disasters of the 19th century. The tragedy of the whale ship Essex later served as inspiration for Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick. Michael Packard, a 56-year-old veteran lobster diver, had spent decades working the waters off the coast of Massachusetts. He was no stranger to danger. His job involved descending into the depths of the ocean, navigating strong currents, and avoiding the ever-present threat of great white sharks. Day in and day out, Packard dove into the ocean's depths, pulling lobsters from their hiding spots on the seabed, ensuring that high-end restaurants had their prized delicacies. Packard's career had already been filled with near-death experiences. Once, he had been swept far out to sea by strong currents, barely surviving after a long search. Another time, he found the body of a fellow diver who had never resurfaced. He regularly encountered sharks, although none had ever attacked him. But his most terrifying brush with death had happened a decade earlier. A small plane he was on crashed in the Costa Rican rainforest, killing 3 people. Packard, along with 5 others, survived for days with internal injuries, only to be rescued just in time. Despite these close calls, nothing had prepared him for what happened on June 11, 2021. Packard headed out early, joining his crew at the harbor. The engine on their usual boat broke down, so most of the crew transferred to another vessel, but Packard stayed with a few trusted colleagues. Confident in their teamwork and the promise of a good catch, he donned his diving suit, strapped on his oxygen tank, and plunged into the cold waters. As he descended to about 15 meters, Packard spotted a group of lobsters and began collecting them. All seemed calm. No sharks in sight, and the bag he carried was steadily filling up. Then, out of nowhere, a force slammed into him. It felt like he'd been hit by a truck. Everything went black. For a moment, Packard thought he had blacked out. Then panic set in. He assumed a great white shark had attacked him, but something felt off. There were no teeth, no sharp pain, only smooth, fleshy walls surrounding him. That's when it dawned on him. He wasn't in a shark's jaws. He was inside the mouth of a whale. Packard thrashed and kicked, trying to escape, but the whale's massive mouth pressed tighter around him. His oxygen regulator slipped from his mouth, and he struggled to regain control of his breathing. Just as he began to lose hope, something changed. A strange light appeared, and suddenly he was jolted upward. The whale, having realized it had sucked in something much larger than its usual prey, surfaced and shook its head violently. Packard was spat out into the ocean. Barely conscious, Packard floated in the water until his crew reached him. In disbelief, they rushed him to the hospital. Miraculously, aside from a few bruises and a sprained knee, he was fine. Scientists later explained that the whale, a humpback, had likely swallowed him by accident while feeding, mistaking him for a school of fish. Though it couldn't have fully swallowed him due to the size of its throat, it had still been a life-threatening experience. The Korean War. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir is one of the most remarkable and brutal episodes in the Korean War. For 17 days, United Nations forces, composed mainly of 30,000 U.S. troops, found themselves encircled by a Chinese force 4 times their size. 120,000 soldiers from the People's Volunteer Army. These Chinese soldiers were sent under the direct orders of Mao Zedong, with the goal of annihilating the UN troops. What followed was a desperate and fierce struggle for survival amidst freezing temperatures and overwhelming odds. The U.S. forces were caught in the harshest winter of the war, with temperatures dropping to -38 degrees Celsius. Their supplies dwindled, and their weapons began to malfunction due to the cold. Many of the soldiers suffered from frostbite, and even basic medical supplies froze, rendering treatments like morphine and blood plasma useless. Radios and vehicles also failed, making communication and movement nearly impossible. At one point, the U.S. troops relied on an airdrop of supplies, hoping for much-needed ammunition and food. Instead, the packages contained Tootsie Rolls, a mistake caused by using the codename Tootsie Rolls for artillery. The candy, however, became a surprising lifeline. Frozen Tootsie Rolls were used to patch bullet holes and repair equipment, while the sugar provided a quick source of energy for the starving soldiers. Despite being trapped in such dire conditions, the U.S. forces managed to stage one of the most remarkable breakouts in military history. Under the leadership of Major General Edward Almond and Major General Oliver P. Smith, the troops fought their way out of the Chinese encirclement. Their retreat was not a simple withdrawal, but rather a series of coordinated attacks. The battle took place around Chosin Reservoir, located in a rugged, mountainous area of North Korea. This region, sparsely populated and remote, became a battleground as the Chinese forces tried to cut off the UN's only retreat route along a narrow, treacherous road. The freezing temperatures and harsh terrain made movement incredibly difficult, but the U.S. Marines, often isolated in small units, held their ground. One of the most heroic stands occurred at a hill overlooking Toktong Pass, where Captain William E. Barber's Fox Company held off Chinese forces for 5 days, preventing them from cutting off the retreat completely. With artillery support and airstrikes, they were able to fend off repeated attacks until the Marines could regroup. Ultimately, the U.S. forces managed to reach the port city of Hungnam, where the largest evacuation by sea in U.S. military history took place. Over 100,000 troops and civilians were evacuated before the port was destroyed to prevent its use by the Chinese. Heinrich Harrer, an Austrian mountaineer, set out on a dangerous expedition to the Himalayas in 1939. At the time, he was not connected to the Nazi regime, but joined a group of climbers, some of whom were on a Nazi mission to plant the swastika flag on a Himalayan peak. Harrer left behind his pregnant wife, Ingrid, promising to return in 4 months. The group, led by Peter Alf Schneider, encountered treacherous conditions on their ascent. Harrer, despite injuries from a fall, pressed on. The climbers faced snowstorms and avalanches that wiped out much of their equipment. Determined, they continued their journey, eventually crossing paths with Tibetan pilgrims. One of the Tibetans handed Harrer a picture of the 14th Dalai Lama, believing it would bring good luck. Soon after, the group was arrested by local authorities in India, who were enemies of Nazi Germany. Harrer and his companions were imprisoned in Ahmednagar. While in prison, Harrer regretted associating with the Nazi-affiliated climbers and longed for his family. He wrote letters to Ingrid, learning through a reply that his son, Rolf, had been born. However, Ingrid informed him that she had remarried his best friend, Horst, and included divorce papers in the letter. Disheartened, Harrer and his companions made multiple escape attempts. Eventually, they successfully fled, disguised as Indian laborers. Harrer, wanting to distance himself from the Nazi mission, separated from the group and continued his journey into Tibet. Peter later rejoined him after some of their companions were captured. Together, they made their way to the Tibetan city of Lhasa. Once in Lhasa, Harrer and Peter were accepted by the local community, and Harrer became friends with the Dalai Lama. Harrer shared his knowledge with the young leader, teaching him about geography, technology, and the outside world. However, as China began asserting control over Tibet, Harrer grew concerned for the Dalai Lama's safety. Despite Harrer's warnings, the Dalai Lama chose to stay with his people. Harrer eventually returned to Austria. Upon his return, he found his wife had moved on, but he was determined to reconnect with his son. At first, Rolf rejected him, but after receiving a gift from Tibet, a bond began to form. Harrer and his son reconciled, and the two went mountain climbing together, a passion Harrer had never lost. Harer's time in Tibet was later immortalized in the 1997 film 7 Years in Tibet, starring Brad Pitt. Though Harer passed away in 2006 at the age of 93, his story remains a tale of survival during times of great turmoil. Hiro Onoda. In 1945, near the end of World War II, Japanese Second Lieutenant Hiro Onoda was stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines. After an American invasion left only him and 3 of his men alive, Onoda took charge, determined to follow his orders to defend the island at all costs. These orders, given before the American attack, instructed him never to surrender or take his own life, no matter the circumstances. For Onoda, this was a duty that transcended the end of the war itself. As American forces secured the island, Onoda and his men retreated into the jungle, carrying out guerrilla warfare. They raided local farms, sabotaged supplies, and lived off the land, all the while convinced that their mission to repel enemy forces was ongoing. Even though Japan had officially surrendered in September 1945, news of this never reached Onoda in a way he could trust. He and his soldiers believed the war was still raging and saw reports of Japan's defeat as enemy propaganda. One by one, Onoda's men fell. Private Akatsu surrendered in 1950, unable to continue the fight. Corporal Shimada was shot by local authorities in 1954, and Private First Class Kozuka was killed during a skirmish in 1972 while attempting to burn local crops. By then, Onoda had been alone in the jungle for nearly 30 years, fighting a war that had ended long ago. His refusal to believe that the war was over turned him into a mysterious figure. Locals feared him as a phantom soldier, terrorizing the island with unexpected attacks. It wasn't until 1974 that a young adventurer named Norio Suzuki set out to find Onoda, the man who had been living in isolation for decades. Incredibly, Suzuki tracked him down and convinced him that the war might truly be over. However, Onoda would not surrender until he received orders from his original commanding officer. Suzuki returned to Japan and found Onoda's former commander, Major Taniguchi, working in a bookstore. Together, they returned to Lubang Island and officially informed Onoda that his mission had ended. At first, Onoda was suspicious, expecting a secret message from his commander telling him that the war was still ongoing. When the truth finally sank in, Onoda was devastated, but he followed orders and surrendered. He handed over his sword to the President of the Philippines, who, in recognition of his unwavering loyalty and dedication, granted him a full pardon for the crimes he had committed during those years. When Onoda returned to Japan, he was hailed as a national hero, his perseverance seen as a symbol of duty and honor. He struggled to adapt to modern life after years in the jungle, eventually moving to Brazil to become a cattle farmer. Later, disturbed by the societal changes he observed in Japan, he returned to open a nature camp to teach young people survival skills and confidence. The Miracle of the Andes. In October 1972, a Uruguayan rugby team, along with their friends and family, boarded a chartered plane bound for Santiago, Chile, eager for a weekend match. The atmosphere was jovial as they anticipated the upcoming game. However, their journey took a harrowing turn when the aircraft encountered severe turbulence over the Andes Mountains. Initially, the turbulence was mild, eliciting laughter and playful banter among the passengers. But as the plane began to descend unexpectedly, the mood shifted to one of concern. The pilots, misjudging their location due to poor visibility, had commenced descent while still over the mountainous region. Suddenly, the aircraft struck a mountain ridge, tearing off its wings and tail. The remaining fuselage slid down the mountain, finally coming to rest in a remote, snow-covered valley. Of the 45 individuals on board, 12 lost their lives instantly, and several others succumbed to their injuries in the following days. The survivors found themselves in a desolate environment, surrounded by towering mountains with no vegetation or animal life in sight. Facing freezing temperatures and a dwindling food supply, they huddled in the wreckage, hoping for rescue. Days turned into weeks, and the initial search efforts failed to locate the white fuselage amidst the snow. The survivors rationed the meager provisions they had salvaged, but starvation loomed as a constant threat. In their desperation, they made the agonizing decision to consume the flesh of their deceased companions to stay alive. One survivor later recounted, Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. After just a few days, we were feeling the sensation of our own bodies consuming themselves just to remain alive. On the 61st day, realizing that waiting for rescue was futile, 3 of the strongest survivors set out on a perilous trek across the mountains to seek help. After 10 days of arduous climbing, they stumbled upon a river and eventually encountered a local man who assisted them in contacting authorities. On December 22, 1972, more than 2 months after the crash, the remaining survivors were finally rescued. Ralph Flores and Helen Klaben. In one of the harshest and most isolated places on Earth, 2 strangers sat huddled in a fragile tent they had built to protect themselves from the unforgiving elements. A man and a young woman, frozen and nearing death, fought against the relentless snowstorm. They were stranded, miles away from the nearest town, unaware that the world believed they were already lost. As the storm began to ease, the young woman spotted a plane in the sky. For a fleeting moment, hope surged through her. But as the aircraft disappeared into the distance, her heart sank. "In the name of God," she whispered, "please come back." She knew her time was running out. Her journey had started in the early 1960s, during a time when youth culture was blossoming and the adventurous spirit of the Beat generation was sweeping across America. Inspired by this, a 20-year-old Jewish girl from New York named Helen Klaben decided to set off on her own adventure. She answered a newspaper ad seeking someone to share gas expenses for a road trip to Alaska. After spending some time there, she had dreams of traveling to the east, India, Hong Kong, or perhaps somewhere else. But first, she needed to reach San Francisco. In early 1963, Helen met Ralph Flores, a 41-year-old amateur pilot from California. They agreed to split the costs of a flight back to the United States, beginning their journey in Alaska. Their first stop was Whitehorse, the capital of Canada's Yukon Territory, and from there, they planned to continue south. But a fierce snowstorm grounded their small single-engine plane for 3 days. Despite the warnings, they decided to fly once more. It was a decision that would change their lives. As they flew, the storm battered their plane, tossing it like a leaf in the wind. Ralph, an inexperienced pilot, struggled to navigate through the storm. With visibility reduced to nothing, they were lost. Then disaster struck. The plane crashed into the side of a mountain near the Yukon-British Columbia border. Miraculously, both survived, though they were injured. Helen with a broken arm, and Ralph with broken ribs and a fractured jaw. They had little in terms of food or survival gear, and the biting cold made every movement painful. For days, they huddled in the wreckage, melting snow for water and finishing off their meager food supplies. Weeks passed. They had no means of hunting and only survived by sheer will. Helen suffered from frostbite, which soon led to gangrene in her foot. Ralph, a devout Mormon, believed their salvation would come if Helen converted and read the Bible, but she remained skeptical. Still, with nothing else to do, she read on. 47 days after the crash, a pilot named Charles Chuck Hamilton, while scouting the area for animals, spotted their SOS signal carved into a frozen pond. By a stroke of luck, Ralph had managed to catch his attention with a mirror. Chuck and local trappers mobilized to rescue the pair, just in time. Helen was on the verge of death, but still alive. Helen recovered, missing a few toes but not her adventurous spirit. She would go on to write a book about her ordeal, which she described as a defining moment of her life. Both she and Ralph lived full lives afterward, forever bonded by their miraculous survival in one of the world's most desolate landscapes. John Coulter. On a cold morning in 1809, John Coulter and John Potts, both veterans of the famous Lewis and Clark expedition, paddled their canoes down the Jefferson River in southwestern Montana. They were seasoned trappers familiar with the land, and their canoes were loaded with beaver pelts from a business venture they had started a year earlier. However, this region was dangerous, as it was the territory of the Blackfoot tribe, a group known for their hostility toward outsiders. A previous expedition had already left Coulter with a leg wound after an attack, but this didn't deter the two men from returning to Blackfoot country. As they glided down the river, they rounded a bend and were met with a terrifying sight. Hundreds of Blackfoot warriors lined the shore. The warriors demanded that the two men come ashore. Faced with a split-second decision, Coulter opted to paddle toward the shore, hoping the warriors simply wanted their goods, but Potts refused to follow. Once Coulter reached the bank, he was immediately captured, disarmed, stripped, and his canoe ransacked. Potts, still in his canoe, refused repeated orders to come ashore. Angered, one of the Blackfoot warriors shot Potts, wounding him. Despite his injury, Potts fired back, killing the warrior who had shot him. This act of defiance sealed his fate. The Blackfoot warriors riddled Potts with arrows and bullets until he lay dead in his canoe. His body was dragged to shore and mutilated, his limbs severed and entrails pulled out. As Coulter stood horrified, his friend's blood and body parts were smeared on him by the warriors. Coulter, fearing he would be next, prepared for death. But instead of execution, the Blackfoot warriors asked if he was a good runner. Though Coulter was known for his physical prowess, he claimed to be a poor runner, guessing the Blackfoot wanted sport. His suspicions were correct when a Blackfoot chief pointed to the open land and simply said, "Go." Coulter took off running, knowing that his life depended on outrunning the group of warriors who quickly gave chase. For miles he sprinted at full speed, his body drenched in sweat, blood, and the remains of his friend. One by one the pursuers fell behind, but one warrior kept pace. As the man neared Coulter, he stumbled, breaking his spear. Coulter seized the opportunity, grabbing the broken weapon and killing the warrior. Coulter continued running, eventually diving into an icy river where he hid under a beaver dam until nightfall. After eluding the Blackfoot, he traveled on foot for 11 days until he reached safety at a trader's fort. Though Coulter survived the ordeal, the Blackfoot haunted him. After another massacre claimed the lives of 17 of his new business partners, Coulter left the mountains for good. He settled in Missouri, where he married and eventually died in 1815. Mauro Prosperi. In 1994, Mauro Prosperi, an accomplished Italian athlete, set out to conquer one of the most grueling endurance races on the planet, the Marathon des Sables, held deep in the unforgiving Sahara Desert. The Sahara, with its scorching heat, sparse water, and vast barren landscape, is one of the harshest places on Earth for humans. Despite these challenges, Prosperi was prepared. A former Olympian, he had trained extensively for the 251-kilometer race, running long distances and limiting his water intake to adjust his body to the severe dehydration he knew he would face. Armed with a backpack full of essentials, food, water, a sleeping bag, a stove, and a single emergency flare, Prosperi was confident he could handle the grueling 6-day race. For the first 3 days, Prosperi made good progress. He covered distances of 18, 22, and 25 miles respectively, and was even in 4th place by the start of day 4. However, it was on this most challenging day that things took a dangerous turn. The temperature hit a searing 46 degrees Celsius. Winds began to stir, gradually intensifying into a full-blown sandstorm. Faced with the choice of waiting out the storm or pushing forward, Prosperi chose to keep running, hoping to maintain his lead. For 8 brutal hours, Prosperi ran through the sandstorm, his visibility reduced to near zero, while sharp grains of sand tore at his face and skin. By the time the storm passed, he realized with horror that he had veered off the race's marked trail. Completely disoriented, Prosperi was now lost in the endless desert with no landmarks in sight and only a small amount of water left. Determined to survive, Prosperi urinated into his water bottle to preserve fluids and spent the night resting. The following morning, he continued his search for the trail, climbing atop dunes for a better view, but all he could see was sand stretching out to the horizon in every direction. Over the next 2 days, Prosperi stumbled upon an abandoned Bedouin shrine, which he used as shelter. He rationed his remaining food and water, resorting to drinking his own urine and even killing bats to drink their blood for sustenance. Despite these desperate measures, his chances of rescue seemed slim. Twice he spotted planes flying overhead and attempted to signal them, but both times his efforts were thwarted by another sandstorm or insufficient flares. On the brink of despair, Prosperi made the difficult decision to take his own life, fearing that if his body were never found, his wife back in Italy would face years of hardship. Using a small knife, he slit his wrists, fully expecting to die. However, his extreme dehydration caused his blood to clot quickly, and when he woke the next morning, he was still alive. Finding new resolve, Prosperi gathered his remaining strength and supplies, determined to survive against all odds. Finally, after enduring 9 harrowing days in the Sahara Desert, Prosperi stumbled upon a nomadic Berber family who were living in a remote camp. They immediately recognized his desperate condition and gave him water and food. The family then took him to a nearby settlement in Algeria, where he received medical attention and was eventually evacuated to a hospital. Prosperi had lost about 18 kilograms, 40 pounds, during his ordeal and was severely dehydrated, but he made a full recovery. Roy Sullivan. Roy Sullivan was born in 1912 in Greene County, Virginia, surrounded by the scenic Blue Ridge Mountains. He was the fourth of 11 children and grew up amidst nature's beauty and its unpredictability. At the age of 28, he joined the National Park's Fire Patrol, a job that took him deep into the wilderness to protect the forests. His life took an extraordinary turn one stormy day in April 1942. Sullivan was stationed in a fire tower overseeing his territory when a thunderstorm approached. The tower had no lightning rod, and as Sullivan watched lightning strike repeatedly, panic set in. He fled, hoping to escape, but before he could make it far, lightning struck him. The bolt left burns and a scar down his leg, but miraculously he survived. It was a rare and frightening experience, but little did Sullivan know, this was just the beginning. It wasn't until 27 years later that lightning found him again. In July 1969, as Sullivan drove along Skyline Drive, a storm erupted. A bolt struck his truck, passing through his open window and leaving his wristwatch charred, his eyebrows singed, and his body in shock. Once again, Roy survived what most would consider a freak accident. The third strike happened while he was tending to his garden in what seemed like calm weather. Without warning, lightning struck a nearby transformer, sending a glancing bolt through his shoulder. Though the injury was minor, the incident added to his growing reputation as a human lightning rod. By the fourth strike in 1972, Roy's story was attracting national attention. This time, he was at a park station when a sudden clap of thunder signaled his fate. Lightning struck, setting his hair on fire and leaving him shaken but alive. His story became the stuff of legends. He appeared on television, was interviewed by David Frost, and was even featured in the Guinness Book of World Records for surviving multiple lightning strikes. The 5th, 6th, and 7th strikes are less well documented, but according to Roy, they occurred under equally bizarre circumstances, one while exiting his truck after a storm, and another while fishing. Despite his resilience, Roy Sullivan's life came to a tragic end. On the night of September 28, 1983, he was found dead from a gunshot wound, with authorities ruling it a suicide. However, some family members believed otherwise, suggesting foul play due to the circumstances surrounding his death. Whether he took his own life or was a victim, Roy Sullivan's life, marked by an extraordinary and bizarre relationship with lightning, remains unforgettable. Adrian Carton de Wyatt. Born in Brussels on May 5, 1880, to a Belgian diplomat father and an Irish mother, his early life seemed destined for something grand. However, despite the prestige of his family, Adrian wasn't satisfied with a quiet, comfortable life. Instead, he craved adventure and danger from a young age. By the time he reached his teenage years, he was fluent in Arabic, thanks to his father's business dealings in the Middle East. When his father remarried, Adrian was sent to a Catholic boarding school in Birmingham, England, where he was groomed to follow in his father's footsteps as a lawyer. But the courtroom had no appeal for Adrian. His true calling, as he would soon discover, lay in war. When the Second Boer War broke out in 1899, Adrian seized his chance. At just 19, still a student at Oxford University, he lied about his age and background to enlist in the British Army. Soon enough, he was off to South Africa, where he got his first taste of battle and his first injuries. Shot in the stomach and groin during an ambush, Adrian was shipped back to England for recovery. But rather than be deterred, he was exhilarated by the experience. He dropped out of school and committed himself fully to a military career, eager to return to the front lines. Adrian's life in the army was one marked by reckless courage. During World War I, he lost an eye, which earned him the nickname the One-Eyed Devil. He even tore off his own fingers when a medic refused to amputate them after a battlefield injury. Whether leading troops to victory or charging into battle with grenades in his teeth, Adrian was a fearless, often reckless soldier. He thrived on the chaos of war, seemingly invincible despite being repeatedly shot and injured. His heroics earned him the Victoria Cross, one of Britain's highest military honors, but the end of World War I did nothing to quell his thirst for combat. Adrian continued fighting in various conflicts across Europe, including defending Poland from Soviet forces. His daring stunts became the stuff of legend, from surviving plane crashes to fending off Cossack cavalrymen with nothing but a revolver. Even at 61, with one eye and one hand, Adrian was unstoppable. During World War II, he survived a plane crash into the Mediterranean and escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Italy by digging a tunnel with other officers. He remained defiant to the end, famously telling Chinese leader Mao Zedong that he despised communism during a post-war diplomatic mission. Adrian Carton passed away at 83, not from war, but from natural causes. Amanda Eller. On May 8, 2019, the 35-year-old physical therapist and yoga instructor went for a routine hike in the Makawao Forest Reserve on the Hawaiian island of Maui. What was meant to be a quick 3-mile walk turned into a 17-day ordeal that tested every fiber of her being. Eller left her phone in her car, wanting to disconnect and immerse herself in the beauty of the forest. While on the trail, she decided to sit and meditate, which led her slightly off course. When she resumed walking, Eller unintentionally took the wrong path, moving deeper into the forest. Realizing her mistake, she tried to retrace her steps, but the dense forest and unfamiliar terrain disoriented her even further. As hours turned into days, Eller found herself without food, shoes, or shelter. She drank water from streams and ate wild plants, relying on her knowledge of wilderness survival. She used ferns and leaves to protect herself from the cold at night. Despite this, her situation was dire. With each passing day, the terrain became more treacherous. She faced constant challenges: swollen feet, sunburns, and exhaustion. Search teams were deployed soon after she was reported missing, but the vastness of the forest and the difficult terrain made the search extremely challenging. Thousands of volunteers combed the area, but finding Eller proved difficult. Helicopters, drones, and search dogs were all used, but the dense jungle concealed her location. Eller, meanwhile, kept moving, knowing she couldn't stay in one place for long. She later recounted that she had multiple moments of despair, particularly when she fell into a ravine and injured herself. This left her with a fractured leg and torn meniscus, significantly limiting her mobility. Despite the pain, she continued to crawl and walk as best as she could, determined to survive. Eller used her yoga and meditation training to stay calm and keep her mind focused on survival. She later credited these practices for helping her maintain hope. On May 24, 2019, after 17 harrowing days, Eller was finally found. A rescue helicopter spotted her near a waterfall deep within the forest, approximately 7 miles from where she had initially started. Her rescuers, a group of friends who were part of the volunteer search team, were overjoyed to see her alive. She was airlifted to safety and taken to the hospital for treatment. Despite the injuries and weight loss, Amanda Eller had survived. Upon her rescue, she spoke about the spiritual aspect of her journey, believing that the experience had a greater purpose. Jennifer Stolpe. In December 1992, James and Jennifer Stolper embarked on a road trip from California to Idaho for a family funeral, bringing along their newborn child. As they drove, a severe snowstorm forced the closure of the main road, leaving them with a difficult decision: return home or take an unfamiliar country road that seemed to lead in the right direction. Determined to continue, they ventured onto the narrow road, unaware of the danger that awaited them. After many miles of driving, they found themselves in northern Washoe County, where their car became stuck in a massive snowbank. With no mobile phones or GPS, common tools we take for granted today, the Stolpers had no way of calling for help. Due to their detour, no one knew where they were. As night fell, they huddled together in their car, hoping someone would pass by. Fortunately, they had packed enough food, including corn chips and fruitcake, to sustain them for a while. For 4 long nights they waited, but no help arrived. Realizing that they might not be found for weeks on such a remote road, They decided to leave the car and search for help on foot. Taking what they could, some food, a sleeping bag, and fire-starting supplies, they set off through the harsh winter landscape. Waist-deep snow and freezing winds made progress slow and grueling. After walking 12 miles, they realized they had completely lost their way in the wilderness and decided to turn back. After nearly 30 hours of walking, Jennifer could go no further. They found a small, shallow cave hidden by bushes, which provided some protection from the biting wind. Desperate and out of options, James made the heart-wrenching decision to leave Jennifer and their child while he continued the search for help. James trudged through snowdrifts and battled savage winds, walking over 30 miles in search of a single soul who could help them. Exhausted and suffering from frostbite, he eventually stumbled upon the home of David Peterson, a Washoe County road maintenance worker. Despite his weakened state, James managed to give detailed directions back to the cave where his family was waiting. Peterson immediately called for help and jumped into his front-end loader, leading the rescue teams that followed behind in snowcats. They worked their way through the deep snow until they found the cave. Inside, Jennifer and the child were alive but dangerously cold, with no food or water left. The Stolpers were taken to the hospital, where the baby was found to be unharmed, though both James and Jennifer lost several toes to frostbite. Their harrowing experience was later turned into a film called Snowbound, the Jim and Jennifer Stolpa story, and was featured in an episode of I Shouldn't Be Alive, capturing their extraordinary tale of survival against the odds. Anna Begenholm. It was a bright, crisp day on May 20th, 1999, near Narvik, Norway. Anna Begenholm, a 29-year-old radiologist, was skiing off-piste with her two friends, Torvin Nesheim and Marie Falkenberg, in the Kulin Mountains. Spring had arrived, but there was still plenty of snow for the trio of expert skiers. Laughing as the wind whipped through her hair, Anna glided smoothly over the icy slopes. That is, until everything went wrong. In an instant, Anna lost her footing. As she tried to correct her balance, one of her skis struck a large rock. She spun uncontrollably, losing all control as she tumbled down the steep slope. Before she knew it, she was crashing into a frozen stream, shattering through nearly 8 inches of ice. Her body was thrown upside down, with her head and torso submerged in the icy water, and her legs, still attached to her skis, sticking out of the stream. Marie and Torvind rushed to her aid, grabbing onto her legs and desperately trying to pull her out. But Anna was wedged between rocks, making it impossible for them to free her. To make matters worse, the cold water was refreezing around her, sealing her even more tightly under the ice. Despite their best efforts, Anna remained trapped, and all that could be seen were her feet sticking out of the ice. Remarkably, an air pocket had formed when Anna crashed through, allowing her to breathe. Her friends called for help, holding onto her feet as they waited for rescue. However, after 40 minutes, the air pocket ran out, and Anna lost consciousness, her body succumbing to circulatory arrest. 2 rescue teams, one climbing down the mountain and another from the top, raced to Anna's location. When they arrived, the situation was dire. They tried everything, tying ropes to her legs, digging through the ice, but nothing worked. Finally, a team arrived with a pointed gardening shovel. They cut a hole in the ice downstream from where Anna was trapped and managed to pull her free. She had been under the ice for an agonizing 80 minutes. When they pulled her out, Anna had no pulse and her body was eerily pale. She was, for all intents and purposes, clinically dead. However, her friends refused to give up and immediately began performing CPR. When the rescue helicopter arrived, they continued their efforts, but by the time Anna reached the hospital, her body temperature had dropped to an astonishing 13.7 degrees Celsius, far below what anyone had ever survived. Yet the head of emergency medicine, Dr. Mads Gilbert, believed in a saying, "A patient's not dead until they're warm and dead." Over the next several hours, a team of over 100 doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to warm her body and restart her heart. Finally, after 2 hours, Anna's heart began to beat again, and slowly she made a miraculous recovery. Despite the odds, Anna survived, thanks to the very cold that had nearly killed her. Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor born in 1676 in the Fife region of Scotland, Selkirk grew up with a spirit of adventure. As a young man, he became a seaman, sailing on various ships and honing his skills. His thirst for adventure eventually led him to join the crew of a privateer ship, the Cinque Ports, which preyed on Spanish ships in the Caribbean. However, Selkirk's life took an unexpected turn in 1704 when, during a voyage in the South Pacific, he had a heated disagreement with the ship's captain. Fearing for his safety and wanting to avoid a disastrous fate at sea, Selkirk made the audacious decision to abandon the ship and instead stay on the uninhabited island of Masa Tierra, now known as Robinson Crusoe Island, located off the coast of Chile. He believed it would be a temporary stop, a mere respite from the chaos of the ship, but fate had other plans. Left alone on the deserted island, with nothing but his clothes, a few tools, and his wits, he built a crude shelter using the island's resources, fashioned a bed from goat skins, and hunted for food. He became skilled at fishing and trapping, subsisting mainly on the island's goats, which he had originally released for their meat. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Time lost its meaning, and Selkirk's only companions were the occasional seabirds and the goats he hunted. For 4 years, Selkirk lived alone on the island. He became a master of survival, foraging for fruits, learning to navigate the changing tides, and finding ways to keep himself entertained in the wilderness. Finally, in 1709, Selkirk's solitude came to an end when he was rescued by an English ship, the Duke, commanded by Captain Woodes Rogers. When he stepped aboard the vessel, he was a changed man, both physically and mentally. He was initially hesitant to return to society, having become accustomed to the ways of island life, but the stories he told of his 4 years in isolation captivated his rescuers and later became the inspiration for Daniel Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe. Selkirk returned to England, where he was celebrated as a hero. However, the adventure that had marked his life remained with him. He eventually returned to the sea, taking part in more voyages, but he never forgot his time on that solitary island. Selkirk passed away in 1721,